A 62-year-old waitress with swollen hands and no future left stands behind the counter of a dying diner in frozen Montana, serving coffee to men who once killed for their country. She doesn't know that the senator's son walking through her door tonight will spit in her face. She doesn't know that 10 bikers in scarred leather will stand up from their seats in a silence more dangerous than any bullet. And she doesn't know that the war about to explode inside this diner will uncover a secret buried so deep it connects the death of her husband to the most powerful family in the state. This story will test everything you believe about justice, cruelty, and who truly protects the forgotten. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. Well, the Red Lantern Diner sat at the edge of nothing, 12 miles outside Millbrook, Montana, on a 2-lane highway that ice had turned into a death wish by November. The building was 60 years old, maybe older, cracked vinyl booths with duct tape patches, a counter scarred by a million coffee rings, fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered like dying insects trapped inside their own glow, the kind of place truck drivers found by accident and regulars kept alive out of habit, or loneliness, or both. Eleanor Vale had worked there for 11 years. She stood behind the counter at 11:47 on a Thursday night, filling salt shakers with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Not from cold, not from fear, from something deeper. The slow erosion of a body that had been working too hard for too long without anyone noticing. 62 years old, 5'4", shoulders rounded from decades of carrying plates and problems that didn't belong to her. Her hair had gone silver 3 years ago, all at once, like her body decided to stop pretending. She had a granddaughter at home. Lily, 9 years old, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that smelled like bleach and regret. Eleanor was raising her alone because her daughter had vanished 4 years ago, walked out one Tuesday morning for cigarettes and never came back. No note, no phone call. Just an empty car seat and a child who stopped asking where mommy went. The debt was the kind that grew teeth. Medical bills from her husband Frank's final year. Pancreatic cancer that ate through their savings before it ate through him. A second mortgage on a house she'd already lost. Credit card interest compounding like punishment. She owed more money than she'd earn in the rest of her lifetime, and she knew it. She'd done the math on a napkin during a break 6 months ago, stared at the number, and then poured herself a cup of coffee and gone back to work. Because that's what Eleanor did. She went back to work. The snow had started at sundown and hadn't stopped. Thick, heavy, the kind of Montana winter that buried cars and killed cattle and made the highway patrol close roads without warning. Through the diner's front window, she could see the parking lot disappearing under white. 4 trucks. A sedan with a cracked windshield. And at the far edge, lined up like a military formation, 10 motorcycles caked in frost and road salt. The Iron Saints. They came every Thursday night. Had for 3 years since their chapter relocated from somewhere in Wyoming nobody talked about. 10 men, ages ranging from late 30s to mid-60s, all veterans, all carrying damage that didn't show on the surface but leaked out in the way they held their coffee cups, too tight, like the ceramic might try to leave, the way they sat with their backs to walls and their eyes on doors, the way conversations between them happened in fragments, half-sentences, nods, silences that held more meaning than most people's speeches. Eleanor didn't know their full stories, didn't need to. She knew the language of broken men because she'd been married to one for 31 years. Frank had come home from his service different, not violent, not angry, just quieter, like someone had turned the volume down on his soul and never turned it back up. He'd sit on the porch for hours watching nothing, and Eleanor would bring him coffee and sit beside him without speaking, because she understood that sometimes presence was more valuable than words. The Iron Saints reminded her of Frank, dangerous on the outside, safe on the inside, the contradiction that most people couldn't understand. Their leader sat at table 9, Gideon Cross, 58 years old, 6'2" with the kind of stillness that made crowded rooms go quiet. His face looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. Deep lines, a jaw that clenched even when he smiled, eyes that were pale gray and saw everything without appearing to look. His leather vest was worn almost white at the shoulders, patches faded from years of weather and wear. A scar ran from his left temple down past his ear, disappearing beneath his collar like a secret that kept going. He'd been Army, 2 tours. Then something classified that nobody in the club discussed. He came back and found his wife had died in a car accident while he was overseas. Found his teenage son had been placed in foster care and beaten so badly he'd spent 3 weeks in a hospital. By the time Gideon tracked the boy down, his son wouldn't look at him, wouldn't speak, wouldn't acknowledge that the man standing in front of him was his father. That was 14 years ago. Gideon hadn't spoken to his son since. He didn't talk about it. None of them talked about the things that had broken them. But those fractures were visible in everything they did. The way they rode too fast in bad weather, the way they drank coffee instead of liquor because half of them were recovering from something, the way they overtipped Eleanor by 300% and pretended they didn't notice. Tonight Gideon was watching her hands. He'd noticed the tremor 6 weeks ago, watched it worsen. Noticed she'd started gripping the coffee pot with both hands to keep it steady, that she'd switched from carrying 3 plates to 2, that she paused between tables to breathe through something, pain, exhaustion, fear, all 3. He'd said nothing. Gideon was the kind of man who gathered information before he acted, who understood that offering help to a proud woman too early was the same as insulting her. But he was keeping count, logging every wince, every catch in her breathing, every time she leaned against the counter when she thought no one was watching. Someone was always watching. At table 3, Noah Hendricks, the club called him Wrench, was rebuilding a carburetor on a napkin. 51. Former Marine mechanic who'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand to an IED outside Fallujah and never mentioned it. He could strip a Harley engine blindfolded and reassemble it in the dark. He could also read people the way he read machines, listening for what was grinding, what was loose, what was about to break. Wrench had noticed Eleanor's hands too. At table 6, Elias Kane sat alone with a medical textbook propped against a sugar dispenser. 44. Former Army combat medic who'd held 17 men while they died and remembered every single one of their last words. He worked at the VA hospital now, 12-hour shifts for pay that wouldn't cover rent in most cities. He drank black coffee and read about trauma surgery the way some people read novels. For comfort, because at least on the page the patient survived. Elias had noticed Eleanor's breathing patterns, and at the end of the counter, a man the club called Shepherd sat motionless with his hands wrapped around an empty cup. 64. The oldest member. Former chaplain's assistant who'd lost his faith in a field hospital and found something else. Not belief, but purpose. He didn't preach. He didn't quote. He just listened with the patience of a man who'd heard every confession a human being could make and decided none of them were unforgivable. Shepherd had noticed Eleanor's eyes. The way the light in them had been dimming for months, slowly, like a candle burning down to nothing in a room nobody entered. They all saw it. None of them said it. That was the Iron Saints way. They protected in silence, acted without announcement, and never made their care feel like charity. Because these men understood something most people never learned. The worst kind of suffering wasn't pain. It was pain that nobody acknowledged. The clock above the counter read 11:52 when headlights swept across the parking lot. Eleanor looked up. The vehicle was wrong for this place and this hour. A black Mercedes AMG, brand new, chrome, gleaming even through the falling snow. It pulled into the lot too fast, fishtailing on ice before stopping diagonally across 2 spaces. The engine cut. The headlights stayed on for a long moment, pointing at the diner's front door like accusation. Something in Eleanor's stomach tightened. The door opened and cold air rushed in carrying snowflakes and the smell of expensive cologne that didn't belong anywhere near this building. A man stepped inside. Young, mid-20s, tall, lean, wearing a cashmere overcoat that cost more than Eleanor's annual salary. His hair was styled with the kind of precision that required a mirror and 45 minutes of self-worship. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a weapon. Camden Royce. Eleanor didn't know his name yet, but she recognized the type. She'd served 1,000 of him across her life. Men who walked into rooms like they'd already purchased everything in them, including the people. Men whose confidence was built on something other than competence. men who looked at waitresses and saw furniture. He scanned the diner with a smirk that tightened every muscle in Gideon's jaw. His gaze slid over the cracked booths, the coffee-stained counter, the buzzing lights, and landed on Eleanor with the precision of someone selecting a target. "This is it?" he said to no one in particular. His voice carried the specific breed of contempt that came from never having earned anything. "This is the famous diner?" He was on his phone. Had been recording since he walked in, holding it at chest level, angled at Eleanor, the screen's glow reflecting off his eyes like something hollow. "I'm driving through the absolute middle of nowhere," he narrated into the camera, "and I found this place. Look at this. This is what real America looks like, folks. Depressing, right?" Eleanor set down the salt shaker, straightened her apron, walked toward him with the menu because that's what she'd been doing for 11 years. Walking toward people who didn't see her and serving them anyway. "Evening," she said. "You can sit anywhere you like." He didn't look at her, still recording. "Can I get, actual food here, or is it all grease and sadness?" At table 9, Gideon set his coffee cup down. The ceramic touched the table without a sound. "We've got a full menu," Eleanor said, her voice steady, professional, stripped of everything except duty. "The pot roast is good tonight." Camden finally looked at her. Really looked. And something ugly moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not cruelty exactly, but the kind of bored malice that comes from a life where other people existed only as entertainment. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 11 years. 11 years. He repeated it like a diagnosis. Doing this. 11 years. His phone was aimed directly at her face now. What happened? What went wrong? The diner went still. Not quiet. Still. The distinction mattered. Quiet was the absence of sound. Stillness was the presence of something dangerous waiting to move. Wrench's hand stopped drawing on the napkin. Elias closed his medical textbook. Shepard's empty cup stayed frozen in his grip. "Nothing went wrong," Eleanor said carefully. "I just work here." "Sure," Camden laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no warmth in it. 11 years pouring coffee in Montana. Living the dream. He turned the camera to scan the Iron Saints table. "And these guys? What are they? A biker gang? Do they come here to feel tough?" Nobody at table 9 moved. Nobody at table 9 needed to. "They're regulars," Eleanor said quietly. "Regulars." Camden smiled. "Perfect. Regular people living regular lives in a regular dump." He pocketed his phone and slid into a booth, putting his wet shoes on the vinyl seat across from him. "Get me whatever doesn't give me food poisoning, and coffee, black, if you can manage that without shaking it all over the table." He'd seen her hands, he'd seen the tremor, and aimed at it. Eleanor's face didn't change. 11 years of serving difficult people had built a mask so perfect it could have been carved from stone. But beneath it, something cracked. A small, barely audible sound in the architecture of her dignity, like a beam shifting in a house that had been standing too long. She poured his coffee. Her hands shook. A few drops spilled onto the saucer. Camden stared at the spill, then at her, then back at the spill. "Jesus," he muttered. "They really don't have standards out here, do they?" At table 9, Gideon's eyes hadn't moved from the back of Camden's head. His breathing had changed, slower, deeper, the kind of controlled rhythm that combat veterans use to keep themselves from doing something they can't take back. The next 30 minutes were a slow-motion dismantling. Camden sent back his food twice, complained about the temperature, complained about the portion, complained about the speed, called Eleanor sweetheart with a tone that turned the word into a slur, snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog, laughed when she stumbled on a wet patch near the kitchen door. The other customers, 2 truck drivers, a nurse finishing a double shift, an old man eating pie alone, watched with the specific helplessness of people who recognized cruelty but didn't know how to stop it. They looked at their plates. They looked away. They did what most people do when someone is being slowly humiliated in public. They hoped it would stop on its own. It didn't stop. At 12:31 a.m., Camden stood up. He walked to the counter where Eleanor was refilling napkin dispensers. He placed his hands flat on the surface and leaned forward until his face was 18 inches from hers. His cologne filled the space between them like poison. "You know what I think?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think you're the saddest person I've ever seen. 11 years, shaking hands, this diner, this life." He paused, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water. "You're what happens when people give up." Eleanor didn't respond. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were wet, but nothing fell. "My father's a senator," Camden continued. "State senator, Camden Royce Sr. You've heard of him?" She hadn't. She didn't follow politics. She followed bus schedules and grocery prices and Lily's school calendar. "He built 3 hospitals. 3. What have you built?" Camden leaned closer. "What's your legacy going to be? Coffee stains and a bad back?" And then he did something that changed everything. He gathered saliva in his mouth, slowly, deliberately, theatrically, and spat directly into Eleanor Vale's face. The spit hit her left cheek and ran down toward her jaw. She didn't move. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the coffee machine gurgled, snow tapped against the windows like fingertips asking to be let in. Then 10 chairs scraped against wood simultaneously. The sound was like a weapon being chambered. The Iron Saints rose from their tables in unison, not fast, not aggressive, but with the kind of coordinated precision that came from years of moving together through situations where timing meant survival. Leather creaked. Boots hit hardwood. 10 men stood in a loose formation between Camden and the door, their faces carrying expressions that were worse than anger. They were calm. Calm in the way that a loaded gun is calm. Calm in the way that the moment before a storm is calm. The kind of calm that told you violence wasn't off the table. It was simply being held in reserve, waiting for a reason to arrive. Camden's smirk died on his face. He'd grown up around power. Senators, lobbyists, donors, people who wielded influence like currency. But those people fought with lawyers and phone calls and press conferences. These men looked like they fought with their hands, and had done it recently enough to remember how it felt. Gideon stepped forward, not toward Camden, between Camden and Eleanor. The movement was slow, deliberate, protective. He positioned himself like a wall made of leather and scar tissue, and silence. "Wipe her face," Gideon said. His voice was low. Not a shout, not a growl, something quieter, something that lived underneath volume where real threat existed. The voice of a man who had given orders in places where disobedience resulted in body bags. Camden blinked. "Excuse me?" "Napkins behind you. Pick it up. Wipe her face, then apologize." Camden's shock curdled into indignation. The familiar armor of privilege reassembled around him. "Do you know who my father is?" "I know who you are," Gideon said. "That's enough. I'll have this place shut down by morning. I'll have every one of you arrested. You're not listening." Gideon hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threatening gesture, and yet the air around him had changed, thickened, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in his immediate vicinity. "I didn't ask what your father could do. I told you what you're going to do, right now, in this diner, in front of this woman you just disrespected." Behind Gideon, the Iron Saints stood like monuments. Wrench had his arms crossed, his damaged hand visible, the missing fingers a silent testament to what these men had already survived. Elias stood with the rigid posture of a man who'd triaged death and didn't flinch anymore. Shepard hadn't moved at all. He simply watched Camden with the ancient, unshakable patience of someone who'd seen every kind of cowardice the human heart could produce. Camden's eyes darted toward the door. Wrench shifted slightly, not blocking, just adjusting, and the message was clear without a word being spoken. "You're not leaving until this is handled." The diner held its breath. Eleanor stood behind Gideon trembling, not from weakness, from the overwhelming, disorienting experience of being protected. She couldn't remember the last time someone had stood between her and harm. Frank had, years ago, before the silence took him, before the cancer took everything else. Since then, she'd been the wall, the shield, the one who absorbed the damage so Lily wouldn't have to. But now a man built from war and grief and leather was standing in front of her, and the relief of it hit her so hard she had to grip the counter to stay upright. Camden reached behind him, picked up a napkin. His hand was shaking now. Not from a medical condition, but from something he'd never experienced, consequence without escape. He turned toward Eleanor, hesitated. "Don't make it a performance," Gideon said from behind him. "Just do it." Camden stepped forward. His eyes met Eleanor's, and for half a second, something flickered in him. Not guilt, not yet, but the first crack in something that had been sealed shut his entire life. He raised the napkin and gently, more gently than anything he'd done in the last hour, wiped the spit from her cheek. "Sorry," he muttered. "Louder," Gideon said. "I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at him, through him, past every expensive layer of entitlement and cruelty to the thing hiding underneath. A boy who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I heard you," she said quietly. Then she turned away and went back to the napkin dispensers. That should have been the end of it. A humiliation met with consequence, a lesson delivered, a story that the truck drivers would retell for years over bad coffee in other dying diners. But Gideon wasn't finished. He followed Camden toward the door. Outside, the snow had intensified, and the Mercedes sat under a white blanket that made it look like something being buried. "You've got two choices," Gideon said, blocking the exit. Not physically, just with presence. "Choice one. You walk out, get in your car, call your daddy, and in a week this is a funny story at some fundraiser. You never change, you never learn, and the next waitress you meet gets it worse." Camden stared at him. "And choice two? 60 days. 60 days of what?" "This diner. Real work. Her rules." Gideon nodded back toward Eleanor. "No money, no connections, no rescue. You show up at 6 a.m. and you don't leave until she tells you to. You learn what it costs to be a person nobody sees." Camden laughed. It sounded like glass breaking. "You're insane." "Probably, but I'm not the one who just spat on a grandmother to feel powerful." The words hit something. Camden's laugh died. His jaw worked sideways. His hands balled into fists at his sides. Not for a fight, but for something else. Something that looked like the beginning of shame. "And if I refuse?" Gideon reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a phone. On the screen was a video, clear, high definition, shot from the Iron Saints table. Camden spitting in Eleanor's face. The angle was perfect. The audio was pristine. Every word he'd said was captured. 37 of my brothers across 6 states, Gideon said evenly, all with social media accounts, all with contacts in veteran communities, all with very long memories, but he paused. "Your father's a senator. How do you think this plays?" Camden's face went white. Not pale. White. The color of a man watching his future rewrite itself in real time. "That's blackmail," he whispered. "That's leverage," Gideon corrected. "Same tool your family's been using for years. Doesn't feel good from this side, does it?" The snow kept falling. The Harley engine sat silent under frost. Through the diner window, Eleanor was washing dishes with her back to them, shoulders curved, moving with the mechanical precision of a woman who had cleaned up other people's messes for so long, she'd forgotten she was also a person. Camden looked at the video, looked at Gideon, looked at the diner. 60 days, he said finally. The words came out hollow, defeated, stripped of every weapon he'd ever carried. Starting Monday. Camden walked to his Mercedes without another word. The engine started with a sound that didn't belong to this place. Too smooth, too expensive, too removed from everything that happened under this roof. The headlights cut through the snow, and the car disappeared down the highway, taillights shrinking into the dark, like 2 red eyes blinking shut. Gideon stood in the parking lot for a long time after, snow accumulating on his shoulders, watching the empty road. Wrench appeared beside him, silent as always, and lit a cigarette that the wind kept trying to kill. "He won't come back," Wrench said. "He'll come back." "How do you know?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He watched the snow erase the Mercedes' tire tracks, covering the evidence that Camden Royce had ever been here. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. The voice of a man who'd learned to read the difference between a person who was cruel because they enjoyed it and a person who was cruel because they'd never been taught anything else. "Because he apologized," Gideon said. "Not well, not because he meant it, but he did it. Most people like him would have called a lawyer." He picked up the napkin. Wrench exhaled smoke into the freezing air. That's a thin wire to hang hope on. I've hung hope on thinner. They stood together in the cold, two broken veterans watching the empty highway, while inside the Red Lantern diner, Eleanor Vale finished washing dishes and leaned her forehead against the kitchen wall and cried for the first time in 3 years. Not from the humiliation, not from the spit, from the devastating, bone-deep relief of realizing she wasn't invisible. Someone had seen her, someone had stood up, and she didn't know yet, couldn't know yet, that the boy who'd spat in her face would walk through that door again on Monday morning, that the 60 days ahead would nearly destroy him in ways his privilege had never prepared him for, that the Iron Saint's protection wasn't just a one-night gesture, but the opening act of something far more dangerous. Because what Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Camden Royce's father had already received a phone call, that the video was already spreading through channels that couldn't be controlled, and that Senator Royce wasn't the kind of man who let his family be humiliated without retaliation. The investigation had already been authorized. The FBI file had already been opened. And the Iron Saints, every member, every chapter, every secret they'd buried across 3 decades of protecting the people the system forgot, were about to become targets of the most powerful political machine in Montana. The war hadn't ended in that diner parking lot. It had just begun. Camden Royce showed up on Monday at 6:14 a.m., 14 minutes late, which was, by every measure that mattered in his previous life, practically early. But Eleanor Vale had been standing behind the counter since 4:30, prepping the kitchen in silence, and she noted the time the way a surgeon notes a first incision, with precision and without sentiment. He stood in the doorway wearing a North Face jacket that cost $800 and boots that had never touched anything dirtier than a country club sidewalk. His face was wrecked, not from a fight, but from a weekend of something worse. Sleeplessness. The bruised, hollowed look of a man who'd spent 3 days arguing with himself and lost. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles pulsed beneath his skin. The diner was empty. Pre-dawn dark pressed against the windows. The coffee machine hissed and popped in the kitchen. The fluorescent lights hadn't warmed up yet, casting everything in a sickly blue-gray that made the room look like the inside of an aquarium. Eleanor didn't greet him. She placed an apron on the counter. White, stained, frayed at the edges. The kind of apron that had absorbed 1,000 spills and survived every single one. "Tie it yourself," she said, and walked back toward the kitchen. Camden stared at the apron, picked it up, held it between his fingers like it was something biological. He'd never worn one. He'd never needed to. Kitchens, in his experience, were rooms other people worked in while he waited for food to appear. He tied it wrong. The strings hung uneven. He looked ridiculous and knew it. That was day 1. By day 4, Camden had burned his right hand on the flat-top grill badly enough to blister. He'd dropped a tray of mugs that shattered across the kitchen floor. And Eleanor had made him sweep up every fragment on his hands and knees without gloves while she timed him. He'd been screamed at by a truck driver for bringing the wrong order. He'd cleaned the men's restroom twice because Eleanor inspected it with a flashlight and found a single streak on the mirror. He hadn't complained, not once, and that silence disturbed the Iron Saints more than anything he could have said. Wrench came in on Thursday afternoon and sat at the counter watching Camden mop the floor near the front booths. The kid's movements were mechanical, aggressive, not the motion of someone working, but of someone trying to murder the floor with a wet rag on a stick. His blistered hand gripped the mop handle, and the raw skin cracked with each stroke, but he didn't stop, didn't wince, didn't slow down. "He's not learning," Wrench said quietly to Gideon, who sat 2 stools down with his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "He's surviving. There's a difference." Gideon watched Camden's back. The way the kid's shoulder blades moved beneath the apron, the way his neck stayed rigid, like he was carrying something on his head that would shatter if he relaxed. "Give it time." "Time for what? For him to check the box and go home?" Wrench leaned forward, dropping his voice. "I've seen this before. Boot camp martyrs. Guys who eat the punishment, never break, and walk out the other side exactly the same person they were going in. Suffering isn't transformation. It's just suffering." "You think I don't know that?" "I think you want to save something that doesn't want to be saved. The words landed between them like a dropped blade. Gideon's jaw tightened. He stared at his coffee. In the silence, the mop squeaked across the floor and the coffee machine exhaled steam, and the wind outside pushed against the walls with the insistent, mindless pressure of a Montana winter that didn't care about human drama. "Maybe," Gideon said finally, "but she's watching him." Wrench looked toward the kitchen window. Through the greasy glass, Eleanor was visible, standing at the prep station, cutting onions with a paring knife, her eyes tracking Camden's movements in the reflection of the stainless steel shelf above her. Not with warmth, not with forgiveness, with something more complicated, the careful attention of a woman deciding whether to invest her remaining energy in something that might not be worth it. "She sees something," Gideon said, "or she's making sure he doesn't steal anything." Gideon almost smiled. Almost. The expression moved across his face like a shadow and disappeared. That night, the club held a meeting in the back room of a storage warehouse 6 miles east of town. No sign on the building, no lights visible from the road, just 10 bikes lined up under a rusted awning and the smell of motor oil and cold concrete. The mood was bad. Elias had received a call from a contact at the VA hospital. Federal agents had been asking questions about the Iron Saints, not local cops, not state investigators, but FBI. Specific questions, the kind that came with badges and subpoenas and the institutional patience to wait years for an answer. "They pulled our charter paperwork from Wyoming," Elias said, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed and his medic's bag at his feet like he was expecting casualties. "They're looking at bank accounts. They're looking at the charity funds. They're treating us like an organization under investigation, not like citizens. Because we embarrassed a senator's kid," Wrench said from the workbench, where he was cleaning a spark plug with methodical precision. "That video went everywhere. His father's fundraising numbers dropped 9% in a week. I checked." "You checked fundraising numbers?" "I check everything. You know that." The room went quiet except for the sound of metal on metal and someone's boot tapping against the concrete floor. Shepard sat in the corner, the oldest man in the room, his weathered hands resting on his knees. He hadn't spoken since the meeting started. He rarely spoke first. He waited until the argument had exhausted itself, then offered the thing nobody wanted to hear. "The question," Shepard said slowly, "is whether the boy is worth what's coming." Every head turned. "We stood up for Eleanor," Shepard continued. "That was right. We confronted a man who was hurting someone. That was right. But bringing him into the diner, holding that video over his head, turning this into a 60-day project—" He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that language could heal or wound. That was Gideon's decision, not the club's. And now the club is carrying the consequence. Gideon stood near the door, arms at his sides, facing the room. His expression didn't change, it rarely did, but something shifted in the air around him, a tightening, like a guitar string tuned 1/2 step too high. "You think I should have let him walk," Gideon said. "I think you made a choice based on what you wish someone had done for your son." The silence that followed was brutal. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. The sentence sat in the middle of the room like an unexploded round, and every man present understood what Shepard had just done. He'd connected Gideon's decision about Camden to the deepest wound the man carried. The son he'd lost, the boy he hadn't been there to protect. The 14-year silence that ate at him like rust on iron. Gideon's hands curled into fists, not aggressive, defensive. The posture of a man protecting something inside himself that was too fragile to survive exposure. "Don't," Gideon said quietly. "It's already said." "Then unsay it." "You know I can't." The two men stared at each other across the cold room. Between them lay decades of shared pain, funerals attended together, hospital visits, nights spent sitting in silence outside each other's houses because solitude was a luxury, and loneliness was a disease. And the difference between them was having someone who knew which one you were carrying. Elias broke the tension by clearing his throat with the subtlety of a man dropping a wrench into a metal bucket. "Whether Gideon's reasons are personal doesn't change the facts," Elias said. "The feds are asking questions. We've got vulnerabilities. The charity fund has irregularities, not illegal, but the kind of bookkeeping mess that looks guilty under a microscope. They want to build a case, they can build one from paperwork alone. We've done nothing wrong, Wrench said. Since when does that matter? The question landed with the weight of every veteran in the room who'd watched the system fail them, betray them, or pretend they didn't exist. They'd all been on the wrong side of institutions that were supposed to protect them. The VA that lost their records, the courts that dismissed their claims, the employers who thanked them for their service and then didn't hire them. These men had built the Iron Saints specifically because the structures designed to help them had collapsed first. And now those same structures were being aimed at them like weapons. We need to know what the senator knows, Gideon said finally, and what he's planning. He looked at Camden's empty seat, the stool near the counter where the kid sat during his breaks, eating toast and staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard focus of someone recalibrating their entire operating system. The kid might be our only way in. Or our liability, Shepard said. Both, Gideon admitted. He's both. The meeting ended without resolution. The men filed out into the cold, mounted their bikes, and rode into the black Montana night in single formation, engines roaring through empty streets where the only witnesses were snowdrifts and stray dogs. None of them spoke as they separated at the highway junction. None of them needed to. They all knew the same thing. The ground beneath them had started to shift. Back at the diner, the next 2 weeks became a war of attrition that neither Camden nor Eleanor acknowledged out loud. She gave him the worst jobs. Not out of cruelty, out of curriculum. Scrubbing the grease trap at 5 a.m. when the cold made the fat congeal into something that looked and smelled like a failed science experiment. Mopping the walk-in freezer. Hauling trash through the back alley where the wind hit so hard it felt personal. Restocking the dry goods from delivery trucks at dawn, 50-pound bags of flour that left his shoulders screaming and his hands white with dust. Camden did all of it. His hands were the first thing to change. Within 10 days, the blisters had hardened into calluses. The soft, manicured fingers that had never gripped anything heavier than a cocktail glass were becoming something else. Rougher, thicker, tools instead of accessories. He noticed one night while washing them in the diner's cramped restroom, holding them under flickering light, turning them over like he was looking at someone else's property. His body changed next. The lean, gym-sculpted physique built by personal trainers and protein shakes began reshaping itself around different demands. His forearms thickened from wringing mops and lifting crates. His posture shifted from the entitled, chest-forward stance of a man expecting to be noticed to the curved, forward-leaning posture of a man doing work. But the deeper changes were slower, quieter, and more dangerous. On day 12, a veteran named Carl came in at 3 a.m. He was 68, lived alone in a trailer park off Route 9, and came to the Red Lantern twice a week because it was the only place that was open and warm and didn't require him to explain himself. He had a tremor in his left hand worse than Eleanor's. He ordered the same thing every time. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. He never spoke except to say thank you, and he always left a $1.50 tip counted out in exact change from a coin purse that had a bullet hole in it. Camden was clearing the table next to Carl's when the old man's coffee cup slipped from his trembling hand and shattered on the floor. Coffee spread across the tile in a dark puddle. Carl stared at it and didn't move. Just stared. I got it, Camden said automatically. He grabbed a rag and knelt. I used to be steady, Carl said. Not to Camden. To the air. To the broken cup. I used to have hands like a surgeon. 52 years, never dropped a damn thing. Camden stopped wiping. Looked up. Carl's face was crumbling, not crying, not falling apart, but eroding, like a cliff face losing its shape to weather. It couldn't stop. It's just a cup, Camden said. It's not just a cup. Camden understood. For the first time in his life, standing in a puddle of cheap coffee on the floor of a diner that smelled like bacon grease and industrial bleach, he understood that objects could carry the entire weight of a person's disappearing capability, that a dropped cup could be a eulogy. He finished cleaning, brought Carl a fresh cup, set it directly in Carl's good hand, his right, and held it there for a second to make sure the grip was solid before letting go. Carl looked at him, really looked. You're that senator's boy, Carl said. Camden's stomach contracted. Yeah. I voted for your father 3 times. I'm sorry. He didn't mean it as an apology for his father. He meant it as an apology for the entire architecture of a system that let a 68-year-old veteran with a bullet hole in his coin purse count nickels for coffee at 3 a.m. in a diner that was falling apart. He meant it the way a person means it when they suddenly see the shape of a building they've been living inside without ever looking at from the outside. Carl said nothing. Drank his coffee, left his $1.50. Camden stood at the counter after Carl left and stared at the wet rag in his hands and felt something moving inside his chest like tectonic plates shifting. Slow, massive, irreversible. Eleanor watched from the kitchen. She said nothing, but she stopped inspecting his work with a flashlight after that. On day 19, the first threat arrived. It came in the form of a black Suburban that parked across the street from the diner at 7 a.m. and didn't move for 6 hours. 2 men in dark suits sat inside with the engine running, watching the front door. They didn't come in, didn't order food, didn't speak to anyone. They just watched. Wrench spotted them first. He was replacing a headlight on his bike in the parking lot when the Suburban appeared, and he tracked it the way he tracked mechanical failures, calmly, methodically, filing the information for later. Feds, he told Gideon by phone that afternoon. 2 of them. Government plates. They're not hiding. They want us to know they're there. Intimidation. Works pretty well, historically. Pull the club's banking records. Everything from the charity fund. Anything that could look wrong under bad light. Gideon, just do it. That evening, after the diner closed, Gideon sat across from Camden at table 9. Eleanor had gone home. The diner was dark except for the neon sign in the window. A red lantern that buzzed and flickered, casting the room in alternating waves of color and shadow. Camden was eating leftover pot roast with the methodical desperation of a man who'd burned 4,000 calories hauling freight and had nothing in his refrigerator at home. Your father's making moves, Gideon said without preamble. Camden stopped chewing, swallowed, set his fork down with the careful precision of someone who knew the conversation was about to get heavy. What kind of moves? Federal investigation, FBI. They've been watching this diner for 3 days. Camden's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, then understanding, then something that looked like exhaustion. The deep, cellular kind that came from finally confirming a suspicion you'd been carrying your whole life. He's using the Justice Department, Camden said flatly. He has friends on the Oversight Committee. He's done it before. Done what before? Camden pushed his plate aside, leaned back. The chair creaked under him. Through the window, the neon sign pulsed its red rhythm. On, off, painting his face in alternating stripes of light and darkness. My sophomore year at Whitfield Prep, Camden said quietly. There was a teacher, Mr. Alderson, history. He caught me cheating on a midterm and reported it. Standard academic violation. Should have been a suspension, maybe expulsion. He paused. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. Within 2 weeks, Mr. Alderson was under investigation for financial fraud, fabricated charges. Someone filed anonymous complaints with the school board. His bank accounts were audited. His wife left him because the stress triggered a medical episode and she couldn't handle the hospital bills. He resigned before the investigation concluded. Gideon sat very still. The charges were dropped 6 months later. Quietly. No headlines. Mr. Alderson was teaching at a community college in Nebraska last I heard, making a third of what he used to. Camden's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man recounting facts he'd sealed behind glass years ago. My father never mentioned it, never acknowledged it. I only found out because I overheard his chief of staff laughing about it at a fundraiser. Laughing. He called it pest control. Gideon's hands were flat on the table. His knuckles were white. The muscles in his forearms were rigid beneath his sleeve, and the scar along his temple seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. That's what you people do, Camden continued. That's what we do. When someone inconveniences us, we don't fight them. We dismantle their life, piece by piece, until they're so broken they can't even remember what they were fighting for. The neon sign buzzed. The cold outside pressed against the glass. Somewhere distant, a truck downshifted on the highway, and the sound rumbled through the building's old bones. "He'll do the same thing to you," Camden said. "To all of you. He'll find every vulnerability in your club, financial, legal, personal, and he'll exploit each one until you either collapse or walk away. And he won't do it himself. He never does it himself. He'll use agencies and intermediaries and bureaucratic processes that look legitimate from the outside but are rotten at the core." "You're telling me this because you've changed," Gideon said, "or because you're scared?" Camden met his eyes. "Both." The honesty of it hit like a fist. Not because it was brave, because it was accurate. Camden was 24 years old and sitting in a dead diner in rural Montana wearing a stained apron and calloused hands and the beginnings of a conscience that terrified him more than any federal investigation could. He was scared of his father, scared of what he was becoming, scared of the space opening up between who he'd been and who he might be, because that space was dark and unfamiliar and there was no guarantee anything better waited on the other side. Gideon looked at him for a long time, the kind of long look that veterans gave each other before missions, not assessing skill, but assessing commitment, willingness to bleed, capacity to hold a line when everything behind it was already burning. "There's something else," Camden said. He pushed back from the table and stood, pacing toward the window. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, gaunt, tired, a stranger wearing his face. "Something I found 6 months ago in my father's home office. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for car keys." "What'd you find?" "Files. Digital copies on a flash drive he kept in his desk. Financial records, transfer authorizations, routing numbers tied to accounts I'd never seen." Gideon leaned forward slowly, the way a predator shifts weight before striking. "My father chairs the State Veterans Affairs Subcommittee," Camden said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He's been diverting funds from veteran healthcare programs for 7 years, skimming grants, redirecting allocations to shell companies he controls through intermediaries. Millions, Gideon. Millions of dollars that were supposed to go to hospitals, treatment programs, disability services." The diner was silent, absolutely, catastrophically silent. The neon sign chose that moment to flicker and die, plunging the room into darkness except for the pale blue light of the parking lot's single surviving lamp filtering through the frost-covered window. In that darkness, Gideon's voice came out like something pulled from the bottom of a well. "Eleanor's husband," he said. Camden turned from the window. "What?" "Frank Vale, Army veteran, served 23 years, pancreatic cancer, died 4 years ago." "I didn't know. He spent his last 14 months on a waiting list for treatment at a VA facility that lost its funding, a facility your father's subcommittee was supposed to be overseeing." Gideon's words came slowly, each one placed with the deliberate weight of a man laying stones on a grave. "Frank Vale died in a bed at home because the money that should have paid for his treatment didn't exist anymore. His wife, the woman you spat on, buried him with money she didn't have and has been drowning in that debt ever since." Camden's back hit the wall behind him. Not from being pushed, from the weight of understanding. Eleanor, her trembling hands, her exhaustion, her debt, her 11 years in this diner, all of it, every sleepless night, every aching joint, every dollar she didn't have, connected by invisible threads to his father's office, to files on a flash drive, to numbers on a spreadsheet that someone had manipulated while veterans died on waiting lists and their families went bankrupt burying them. The diner wasn't just a diner. It was a crime scene, and he'd been standing in it for 19 days without seeing it. "I need that flash drive," Gideon said from the darkness. Camden was shaking. Not his hands, his entire body. A full system tremor that started in his chest and radiated outward like cracks spreading through ice. "If I give you that drive," Camden said, "I'm done. You understand that? Not suspended, not embarrassed, done. He will erase me. He will cut me off from everything. Money, family, contacts, the future I was supposed to have. Everything." "I know. And you're asking me to do it anyway." Gideon stood up. His silhouette filled the space between the tables like something carved from the dark itself. He moved toward Camden slowly, deliberately, not threatening, but present, the way a wall is present when you need something to lean against. "I'm not asking you anything," Gideon said. "I'm telling you what exists. A woman who raised her granddaughter on coffee tips because your father stole the money that should have saved her husband. Veterans across this state who suffered because someone decided their lives were worth less than a senator's portfolio. That's not a request. That's a fact." He stopped 3 feet from Camden, close enough to see the kid's eyes glistening in the pale blue light, close enough to hear his breathing, ragged, shallow, the breath of a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't climb back from. "What you do with that fact is your business," Gideon said, "but you don't get to unknow it." Outside, an engine turned over in the cold, then another, then another. The Iron Saints were arriving for their Thursday night gathering, headlights sweeping across the frost like searchlights probing enemy terrain, leather and exhaust, and the sound of boots on frozen gravel. Camden stood against the wall in the dark diner, wearing a stained apron over a body that no longer felt like his own, and understood with absolute devastating clarity that he had reached the place where retreat was no longer possible. Behind him was the life his father built, comfortable, corrupt, purchased with stolen futures. In front of him was something with no name and no safety net and no guarantee of survival. His hands were shaking. The calluses on his palms caught the faint light. These were not the hands he'd walked in with 19 days ago. These were not the hands of a senator's son. And the choice they were about to make would burn every bridge between the boy he'd been and whatever wreckage waited on the other side. Camden drove to his father's estate at 2 a.m. The roads were empty. Black ice glazed the asphalt like a warning nobody had written down. His headlights cut through freezing rain that fell sideways, slashing against the windshield in sheets that the wipers couldn't keep up with. The Mercedes, the same car that had carried him into the Red Lantern Diner 22 days ago, like a weapon aimed at a woman who'd done nothing but exist, now felt like a coffin on wheels. The leather seats smelled like his old life. The heated steering wheel felt like a lie shaped to fit his hands. He hadn't told Gideon he was going tonight. Hadn't told anyone. The conversation at Table 9 had ended 3 hours ago with Gideon walking out into the parking lot where the Iron Saints waited on their bikes, engines rumbling beneath the cold sky like mechanical heartbeats. Camden had watched them ride away through the diner's window, 10 silhouettes disappearing into darkness, red taillights bleeding into the rain. Then he'd sat alone for 47 minutes. He'd sat in the dark diner with the neon sign dead and the coffee machine cooling and the silence pressing against him like a physical weight, and he'd thought about Frank Vale, a man he'd never met, a veteran who'd served 23 years and died on a waiting list because the money that should have kept him alive had been rerouted through shell companies and buried in spreadsheets by a senator who went home every night to an estate with 7 bedrooms and a wine cellar that cost more than Eleanor's apartment building. His father. The estate sat 14 miles north of Millbrook on 40 acres of land that had belonged to the Royce family for 3 generations. Stone walls, iron gate, security cameras mounted on every corner like mechanical eyes that never blinked. Camden punched in the code, his birthday, because his father was the kind of man who used personal dates for security systems as a gesture of intimacy he'd never actually felt. And the gate swung open with a hydraulic whisper. The house was dark except for a single light in the second-floor study. His father was awake. Camden parked near the garage, killed the engine, and sat in the car for 2 full minutes listening to the rain hit the roof. His hands were on the steering wheel. The calluses scraped against the leather. 22 days ago, those calluses hadn't existed. 22 days ago, he'd been a different person with different hands and a different understanding of what those hands were for. He got out. The rain hit him immediately, cold, needle-like, the kind of Montana rain that felt personal. He crossed the gravel drive, entered through the kitchen door using his key, and stood in the darkened kitchen that smelled like marble cleaner and imported espresso, and the absence of anything resembling warmth. The flash drive was in his father's study, top drawer, left side, behind a box of monogrammed stationery that nobody used because nobody in this family wrote letters to anyone they actually cared about. Camden climbed the stairs, each step silent. He'd learned to move through this house without sound when he was 12, navigating around his father's moods the way sailors navigated around storms. The hallway was lined with photographs, his father shaking hands with governors, posing at ribbon cuttings, standing behind podiums with the American flag draped like a costume behind him. In every photograph, Senator Camden Royce Sr. wore the same expression, a smile that stopped at the cheekbones and never reached the eyes. The study door was open. His father was sitting behind the mahogany desk, waiting. "Sit down, Camden." The voice was calm, perfectly modulated. The voice of a man who controlled rooms the way other people controlled pets, with a combination of authority and the implicit threat that disobedience would be punished in ways you wouldn't see coming. Senator Camden Royce Sr. was 61 years old, tall, lean, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and vacations and places where the staff called you sir without being asked. He wore a navy robe over pressed pajamas. A glass of scotch sat on the desk beside a closed laptop. The desk lamp cast a cone of warm light that made the rest of the room disappear into shadow. Camden stood in the doorway. He didn't sit. "It's 2 a.m, his father said. "You smell like grease." "I've been working." "Working." The senator said the word like it was a foreign language phrase he'd encountered in a textbook but never expected to use in conversation. "At that diner?" "Yes." "With those men?" "Yes." His father lifted the scotch, drank, set it down with a precise click against the desk's surface. Every movement choreographed, every gesture designed to communicate control. "I've been patient with you, Camden. I've allowed this episode to continue because I believed it would burn itself out. Young men have phases, rebellions, moments of theater." He folded his hands on the desk. "But you've been photographed. You've been seen. My staff is fielding calls from reporters asking whether the senator's son is now a line cook at a truck stop." "It's a diner?" "It's an embarrassment." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Camden felt it land, not in his ego, where it would have landed a month ago, but somewhere deeper, in the place where he'd started to store the new things he was learning, the place where Carl's dropped coffee cup lived, where Eleanor's trembling hands lived, where the smell of industrial bleach and bacon grease had started to replace the smell of expensive cologne as the sensory signature of his actual life. "I need to get something from your desk," Camden said. His father's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of recalibration, the way a machine adjusts when it detects unexpected input. "What could you possibly need from my desk at 2 a.m? Camden looked at the top drawer, left side. His father followed his gaze. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the entire temperature of the room changed. The study, which had been performing the role of a civilized space, warm lamp, expensive scotch, father and son in a late-night conversation, became something else entirely. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, the rain outside intensified as if the weather itself understood that something was shifting. "Ah," his father said. 1 syllable. That was all it took. "You found the drive." Camden didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence in this room at this hour was answer enough. His father leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. He studied Camden the way a chess player studies a board after an opponent's unexpected move. Not panicked, not angry, but recalculating. "When?" 6 months ago. "And you've been sitting on it." "I didn't know what it was." "Not really. Not until tonight." "What happened tonight?" "I learned that a woman I work with lost her husband because of what's on that drive. A veteran. He died on a waiting list for treatment at a facility that lost its funding because you redirected it." Senator Royce's face was a mask, perfect, smooth, impenetrable. The face of a man who had spent 30 years in politics perfecting the art of showing nothing. "That's a dramatic interpretation of very complex budget mechanisms," he said evenly. "Federal healthcare funding involves dozens of committees, hundreds of variables." 7 years, Camden interrupted. "Shell companies, routing numbers you tried to bury. It's all on the drive." "You don't understand what you're looking at." "Then explain it to me." His father smiled. Not warmth, strategy. The smile of a man selecting his next weapon from a very full arsenal. "Sit down, Camden." "No." The refusal landed like a gunshot. In this house, in this room, in the 24 years of Camden's life, he had never refused a direct instruction from his father. The word cracked something open between them. Not a door, but a wall. A wall that had been standing so long neither of them remembered who'd built it or what it was protecting. Senator Royce stood up. He was taller than Camden by 2 inches. He moved around the desk slowly, deliberately, positioning himself between his son and the drawer. The lamp threw his shadow across the floor, long, angular, the shadow of a man who had learned to make his physical presence communicate the same authority as his words. "Let me tell you something about the world you've suddenly decided to save," he said. "Those men, those bikers, they're not what you think they are. The Iron Saints have a history: Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, chapters that have been investigated, disbanded, reorganized. They operate in a gray area between charity and vigilantism, and the line between protector and criminal is thinner than you'd like to believe. They're veterans. They're useful idiots who ride motorcycles and intimidate people they've decided deserve it, and you've handed them leverage against me. Against us, because a waitress made you feel guilty about your upbringing." "She didn't make me feel anything. You did. With this." Camden pointed at the drawer. "With the money you stole from people who served this country. I funded infrastructure projects that created jobs in 3 counties. I supported education initiatives that you let veterans die." The words came out louder than Camden intended. They bounced off the study's walnut paneling and expensive bookshelves and framed degrees and echoed back at both of them like something alive. His father's mask cracked. Just for a second. A fracture line ran across his expression. Not guilt, not shame, but something worse. Irritation. The pure, concentrated annoyance of a man whose carefully managed world was being disrupted by someone he'd never considered a threat. "You're a child," Senator Royce said quietly. "You've spent 3 weeks pouring coffee, and you think you understand systems that took me decades to build. You think morality is simple. You think there are good people and bad people, and you've picked a side. That's not how the world works. Maybe not your world. There is no other world. There's this one. And in this one, power has a cost. Every hospital I built, every road I funded, every job I created, all of it required capital that came from somewhere. All of it required decisions that uncomfortable people in uncomfortable positions would rather not examine too closely. That's governance. That's leadership. That's what grown-ups do." Camden stared at his father's face. The lamplight carved it into planes of light and shadow. Cheekbones, jaw, the deep vertical line between his brows that appeared when he was calculating. For the first time, Camden saw his father not as a figure of authority, but as a structure. An architecture of justification built so carefully over so many years that the man inside it had forgotten he was trapped. "Frank Vale," Camden said. "Who?" "The veteran who died. Eleanor's husband. Frank Vale." "I don't know that name." "That's the point." The rain hammered against the study window. The lamp flickered once, a brief interruption in the warm light that made both their shadows jump on the wall like nervous animals. "Give me the drive," Camden said. "No." "Then I'll take it." Senator Royce reached into his robe pocket and pulled out his phone, placed it on the desk with the screen facing up. The gesture was precise, theatrical, the political equivalent of placing a loaded weapon in plain sight. "One phone call," he said. "That's all it takes. One call to the FBI field office, one call to my contact on the oversight committee. Those bikers will be under federal investigation within 24 hours. Their bank accounts frozen. Their charity audited down to the last receipt. Every member, every chapter, every minor infraction they've committed in the last decade, all of it will be on the table. You already made that call. The FBI is already watching the diner." His father's expression shifted. Surprise, genuine surprise, but flickered across his features before the mask reassembled. He hadn't expected Camden to know that. He'd underestimated the flow of information between the diner and his son, and the miscalculation was visible in the way his jaw tightened. "Surveillance is one thing," Senator Royce said, recovering. "Prosecution is another. Right now they're watching. I can make them act. I can make them dismantle that club piece by piece until there's nothing left but parking tickets and broken men. They're already broken men. That's the whole point. They were broken before you ever touched them. The war broke them. The VA broke them. The system you were supposed to be running broke them. And they're still standing. They're still protecting people. They're still showing up at a diner every Thursday night to make sure a 62-year-old waitress isn't invisible. Camden's voice cracked on the last word. Not from emotion, from pressure. The pressure of saying things he'd never said in a room where truth had always been a liability. "You sound like them now," his father said. "That's fast. 3 weeks and you're already reciting their mythology." "It's not mythology. I watched it happen." "You watched a performance. They're very good at performances. The leather, the silence, the brooding, it's theater. The same way my suits and handshakes are theater. Everyone performs, Camden. The only question is what the performance is designed to get." "What did yours get? $4 million from the Veterans Fund in fiscal year 2019 alone?" The number landed like a physical blow. His father's hand moved involuntarily toward the desk drawer. A reflex, protective, the instinctive gesture of a man guarding the evidence of his own crimes. "You memorized the numbers," the senator said. "I memorized all of them." For the first time since Camden had walked into the room, something like fear crossed his father's face. Not terror, not the desperate animal fear of immediate threat, but the slow, creeping recognition that he had miscalculated something fundamental. He'd raised his son to be a mirror, a smaller, softer version of himself. An heir to the architecture of power he'd spent a lifetime constructing. And somehow, in 3 weeks of pouring coffee and scrubbing grease traps and talking to broken veterans in a dying diner, that mirror had shattered and reassembled into something he didn't recognize. "I'm going to give you one chance," Senator Royce said. His voice had changed, lower, harder. The voice of a man transitioning from negotiation to warfare. "Walk out of this room, go home, sleep. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk about this like rational adults. I'll make arrangements. The investigation into the bikers will be scaled back. The waitress will be left alone. Nobody gets hurt. And the drive will be dealt with." "Destroyed, you mean?" "Handled." Camden looked at his father, looked at the desk drawer, looked at the phone sitting on the desk like a trigger mechanism for a bomb that could destroy 10 men whose only crime was protecting people the system had abandoned. "I'm not leaving without it," Camden said. "Then you're not leaving as my son." The sentence was delivered without heat, without drama, with the precise surgical efficiency of a man who understood that the most devastating threats were the ones spoken calmly, because calmness communicated that the speaker had already accepted the outcome and was merely informing the target. Camden felt it hit, felt it go through him, not like a bullet, but like cold water, filling every hollow space inside his chest. "Not leaving as my son." 6 words that contained the entire architecture of his identity. His last name, his inheritance, his position in a family that had defined him since birth, all of it offered as a trade for a flash drive the size of his thumb. "She has a granddaughter," Camden said. The words came out strange, disconnected, almost irrelevant. "Eleanor. She's raising a 9-year-old girl named Lily. They live above a laundromat. The mattress is on the floor." "What does that have to do with everything?" "It has to do with everything. Because that little girl's grandfather died because of you, because the money that should have saved him paid for this." Camden gestured at the room, the walnut paneling, the leather chair, the shelves lined with first editions nobody read, the entire cathedral of wealth built on stolen futures. "This room is made of dead veterans." Senator Royce's face went rigid. Something happened in the space between them. Something invisible and irreversible. The last thread connecting father and son, not love, not even obligation, but the basic biological recognition that they shared blood, stretched to its breaking point and held there, vibrating, waiting for one of them to let go. Camden moved. He stepped around his father, close enough to smell the scotch on his breath, close enough to see the veins pulsing in his temple, and pulled open the desk drawer. His hands found the box of monogrammed stationery. Behind it, exactly where it had been 6 months ago, the flash drive sat against the wood like a splinter that the desk had been trying to push out. His father grabbed his wrist. The grip was strong, stronger than Camden expected from a man who'd never done manual labor, fueled by adrenaline and the specific desperation of a cornered predator. Their eyes met at a distance of 8 inches, close enough to see each other's pupils dilate, close enough to share the same breath. "You don't understand what you're starting," Senator Royce whispered. "This will destroy more than me. The people who benefit from those funds, the contractors, the administrators, the officials who look the other way, they will come for you. They will come for those bikers. They will come for that woman and her granddaughter. You're not fighting me, Camden. You're fighting a system that has survived longer than either of us and will not hesitate to crush anyone who threatens it." Camden pulled his wrist free. He held the flash drive between his thumb and forefinger. It was black, featureless, small enough to disappear inside a closed fist, and it contained enough evidence to end his father's career, trigger a federal investigation, and potentially send one of the most powerful men in Montana to prison. "Then I'll fight the system," Camden said. He walked out of the study, down the stairs, through the kitchen that smelled like marble and espresso, into the rain that hit his face like a baptism performed by weather instead of faith. He got into the Mercedes, started the engine, and drove through the iron gate that swung open for the last time with his birthday code. By sunrise, Senator Royce would have changed every lock, every code, every access point. Camden's credit cards would be frozen. His bank accounts, which held money gifted by his father, would be emptied. His name would be removed from every piece of family property, every trust, every document that connected him to the Royce dynasty. He drove through the rain toward Millbrook with the flash drive in his jacket pocket and nothing else. No plan, no money, no future that he could see beyond the reach of the headlights. Just a piece of black plastic holding 7 years of stolen money and dead veterans and a woman's husband who should have survived. 40 minutes later, he pulled into the Red Lantern Diner's parking lot and killed the engine. The diner was dark. The neon sign was still dead. The parking lot was empty except for one vehicle, a black Suburban parked at the far edge, engine running, 2 silhouettes visible through rain-streaked windows. FBI. They were still watching. Camden sat in his car, staring at the Suburban, and realized something that made his blood turn cold. The FBI agents weren't just monitoring the Iron Saints anymore. They were monitoring him. His father had anticipated this. Every move Camden had made tonight, driving to the estate, confronting his father, taking the drive, had been observed, logged, reported. He was no longer a senator's wayward son having a rebellious phase. He was evidence. His phone vibrated, a text from a number he didn't recognize. 6 words. "We know what you took." Camden's hands closed around the flash drive so hard the edges cut into his palm. Through the rain, the Suburban's headlights flashed once, a deliberate, measured signal that could have meant anything, but clearly meant one thing. "You're being watched." And in that moment, sitting in a dead parking lot outside a dark diner in a Montana rainstorm with federal agents watching and his father's empire already mobilizing against him, Camden Royce understood something that made his chest physically hurt. He couldn't go forward alone. The evidence on the drive was meaningless without someone willing to stand beside him when the system came crashing down. His father was right about one thing. This wasn't a fight against a man. It was a fight against an architecture of corruption that had survived decades by destroying anyone who threatened it. He needed the Iron Saints. But the Iron Saints didn't trust him. Shepard's words echoed in the rain-filled silence of the car. The question is whether the boy is worth what's coming. He wasn't worth it. He knew that. 22 days of mopping floors and pouring coffee didn't erase 24 years of being the exact kind of person these men had spent their lives protecting people from. He was still Camden Royce, still the man who'd spat in a grandmother's face for entertainment, still the son of the man who'd stolen futures from the very people the Iron Saints had sworn to protect. But he was also the only person alive who had the evidence to stop it. And somewhere in Millbrook, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, Eleanor Vale was sleeping on a couch so her granddaughter could have the bed, dreaming whatever dreams a woman who worked 60-hour weeks on trembling hands dreamed, not knowing that the boy who'd humiliated her was sitting in a parking lot with the proof of why her life had been destroyed clutched in his bleeding fist. Camden picked up his phone, dialed the only number he'd memorized in the last 3 weeks. Gideon answered on the second ring. No hello, no greeting, just the sound of breathing. Slow, measured, the breath of a man who slept light because sleeping heavy got people killed. I have it, Camden said, but the drive. I have it. Silence. And they're watching me. Right now. FBI. In the parking lot. More silence. Then Gideon's voice, low and rough with something that lived between exhaustion and the beginning of a plan. Don't move. Don't talk to them. Don't touch the drive again. Gideon, I said don't move. The line went dead. Camden sat in the dark car, rain drumming on the roof, federal agents watching from 50 yards away, his father's empire disintegrating behind him, and something terrifying and nameless assembling in front of him, and he waited. He waited the way he'd watched Eleanor wait, not with hope, not with certainty, but with the stubborn, exhausted patience of a person who had nowhere left to go and no one left to be and nothing left to do except trust that someone was coming. 15 minutes later, he heard them. The sound started as a rumble on the edge of hearing, low, rhythmic, the unmistakable bass note thunder of Harley engines coming through rain. It built slowly, growing louder, vibrating through the car's frame and into Camden's bones. Headlights appeared on the highway. Not 2, not 4, but 10, cutting through the storm in single formation like a convoy advancing on a position. The Iron Saints rode into the parking lot and formed a line between Camden's Mercedes and the FBI Suburban. 10 bikes, 10 men. A wall of leather and chrome and engine noise that turned the parking lot into something that felt like a perimeter, like a fortification, like the physical expression of a promise that had been made in silence and was now being honored in the rain. Gideon dismounted first. His boots hit the wet asphalt. Rain ran down his leather vest and dripped from the scar along his temple. He walked to Camden's car, opened the passenger door, and got in. He didn't look at the Suburban, didn't acknowledge the FBI agents, didn't waste a single gesture on the surveillance apparatus that was recording everything. He looked at Camden. And in the interior light of the car, with rain hammering the roof and 10 motorcycles idling like a protective heartbeat outside, Gideon Cross saw something in Camden Royce's face that he'd been looking for since the night he'd handed a napkin to a boy who'd never been told no. Not courage, not redemption, not even conviction. Just the raw, terrified, unmistakable expression of a man who had finally chosen the thing that would cost him everything, and was sitting in the wreckage of that choice, shaking, bleeding from the edges of a flash drive pressed into his palm, asking without words for someone to tell him what came next. "Show me," Gideon said. Camden opened his fist. The flash drive sat in his palm, spotted with blood from where its edges had broken skin. Gideon looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Camden. "This changes everything," Gideon said. "For you, for us, for Eleanor. There's no version of this that's safe. No version that's clean. You understand that?" "I understand." "Your father will use everything he has, and what he has is more than you think." "I know what he has." "No, you don't," Gideon's voice dropped. "Because what I'm about to tell you is something I was hoping I'd never have to say." Camden's blood went cold. "Your father didn't just steal money from the Veterans Fund," Gideon said slowly. "He also funded the program that was supposed to investigate the theft. He appointed the oversight committee. He selected the auditors. Every mechanism designed to catch him was built by him." Gideon paused, and the rain filled the silence like static, including the FBI team that's sitting in that parking lot right now. Camden turned to look at the Suburban through the rain-streaked window. The agents inside weren't watching the Iron Saints. They were watching him. "They're not here to investigate us," Gideon said. "They never were. They're here to recover that drive before it reaches anyone who isn't already owned by your father." The realization hit Camden like a car wreck, total, disorienting, and impossible to undo. Every assumption he'd carried into this night, that the FBI was a neutral institution, that federal agents served the law rather than the men who funded their assignments, that the system had mechanisms for self-correction, collapsed into rubble. The Suburban's engine revved once, a low, deliberate sound that carried through the rain like a warning, Then its headlights turned on, and it began moving toward them. Gideon didn't flinch. The Suburban's headlights swept across the rain-soaked parking lot like searchlights, cutting white beams through the downpour that reflected off chrome and wet leather and 10 motorcycles idling in formation. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately slowly, the way a predator moves when it wants you to know it's coming. Gravel crunched beneath its tires. Windshield wipers slapped back and forth in a rhythm that sounded mechanical and merciless. "Give me the drive," Gideon said. Camden's fist was still closed around it. Blood from the cuts in his palm had mixed with rain and sweat, making the plastic slick, warm, alive in his grip like something with a heartbeat. "If they take it, they won't. Give it to me." Camden opened his hand. Gideon took the flash drive with the calm, precise motion of a man who'd handled things under pressure that made this moment look like a coffee break. He slid it into the inside pocket of his leather vest, the pocket closest to his chest, behind the worn fabric and faded patches and 30 years of road dust and weather, where his heartbeat could guard it. The Suburban stopped 15 feet from Camden's car. Both front doors opened simultaneously. Two men stepped out into the rain, dark suits already soaking through, federal haircuts, federal posture. The taller one, mid-40s, square jaw, the kind of face that had been assembled from a catalog of authority, walked forward with his badge held at chest height. The shorter one hung back near the vehicle, his hand resting on his hip, in a gesture that was less about accessing a weapon and more about communicating that accessing it was possible. "Special Agent Mercer," the tall one said, raising his voice above the rain. "FBI, we need to speak with Camden Royce." Behind the Mercedes, the Iron Saints sat on their bikes like statues carved from weather and leather. 10 engines rumbling, 10 men watching. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The rain hammered down on all of them equally. Federal agents and bikers and a senator's disowned son, and none of them seemed to notice. Gideon opened the passenger door and stepped out of Camden's car. He stood in the rain with his vest darkening from the water, his scar glistening under the parking lot's single lamp, his hands at his sides. Open, visible, not threatening, not surrendering, just present. "He's busy," Gideon said. Agent Mercer's eyes moved from Gideon to the line of motorcycles behind him. The calculation was visible, not fear, but assessment, the same way a man calculates wind speed before taking a shot. "This isn't a request, sir. We have reason to believe Mr. Royce is in possession of materials relevant to an ongoing federal matter. We'd like to have a conversation. At 3 a.m, in a parking lot, in the rain. The timing is his choice, the conversation isn't." Well, Gideon looked at Mercer the way he'd looked at 1,000 men who believed their authority was absolute, with the patient, unmovable stillness of someone who'd learned that real authority had nothing to do with badges or titles or the institutional machinery behind them. "You want to talk to him?" Gideon said. "You can talk to him in daylight, at a lawyer's office, with representation present. That's how the law works, you know that. I'm trying to do this the easy way. No, you're not. You're trying to do this the fast way, before whatever you're trying to contain gets out." Mercer's jaw tightened. The rain ran down his face in streams that made him look like he was melting. Behind him, his partner shifted weight from one foot to the other. The nervous, unconscious motion of a man who hadn't signed up for a standoff with 10 bikers in a rainstorm. "Gideon Cross," Mercer said. "Iron Saints MC, President, former Army. 2 tours, Afghanistan and Iraq. Decorated, honorably discharged." He paused, letting the biography hang in the wet air like a dossier, read aloud at a hearing. "I know who you are. I know what your club does. I know about the charity work, the veteran outreach, the community presence. I also know about Wyoming." Something shifted in Gideon's face. Not much. A fraction of a degree. Like a compass needle adjusting to a magnetic field that had just changed direction. "Wyoming was cleared," Gideon said. "Wyoming was complicated, and complicated has a way of becoming relevant again when people start looking closely." Mercer took a step forward. The rain intensified, if that was possible. Heavier, colder, the kind of rain that felt like it was trying to push everything flat. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Cross. I'm trying to prevent this from becoming something none of us can control. Then stop working for the man who's controlling it. Mercer blinked. One long, slow blink that lasted a beat too long to be involuntary. In that blink, Camden, who had gotten out of the car and was standing behind Gideon, soaked through, shaking, saw something he hadn't expected. Doubt. The kind of doubt that lived in the space between a man's orders and his conscience, grinding like gears that didn't quite mesh. "I don't know what you think you know," Mercer began. "Senator Royce," Gideon said, cutting him off with the precision of a scalpel. "State Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, 7 years of diverted funds, shell companies, stolen healthcare money, veterans dying on waiting lists." He paused. "Let the rain fill the space. And an FBI field team assigned to recover the evidence before it reaches anyone who isn't on his payroll." Mercer's face went rigid. Not the rigidity of anger. The rigidity of a man who had just heard the architecture of his assignment described out loud by someone who should not have been able to describe it. The silence lasted 5 seconds. 5 seconds in a freezing parking lot in Montana, with rain coming down like the sky had decided to drown the entire county. 5 seconds during which every person present understood that the situation had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Mercer turned to his partner. A look passed between them, the kind of look that carried entire conversations in a single glance. The partner shook his head once. Small, almost imperceptible, but Camden caught it. Gideon caught it. "We'll be back," Mercer said. He didn't phrase it as a threat. He phrased it as weather, inevitable, impersonal, beyond anyone's ability to prevent. "And next time, it won't be a conversation." He walked back to the Suburban. His partner followed. The doors closed, the engine revved. The headlights swung away from the Iron Saints formation, and the vehicle pulled out of the parking lot, tires spraying water across the gravel, taillights shrinking into the storm until they disappeared entirely. Nobody moved for 30 seconds. Then Wrench killed his engine. The sudden absence of sound was violent, like a heartbeat stopping. He dismounted, walked to Gideon, and stood beside him in the rain with his arms crossed and his damaged hand visible, the missing fingers catching water that dripped from his leather glove. "That bought us hours," Wrench said. "Not days. Hours." "I know." "What's the play?" Gideon looked at Camden. The kid was standing in the rain with his arms at his sides, his stained apron still tied over his jacket, his hair plastered flat against his skull. He looked like something the storm had picked up and deposited in the wrong place. Too young, too wet, too shaken to be standing at the center of something this dangerous. But his eyes were steady. That was the thing Gideon had been watching for. Not courage, not defiance, but steadiness. The ability to stand in the middle of chaos and not look away. "The play," Gideon said, "is the courthouse." Inside the diner, the dead neon sign suddenly flickered back to life. The red glow spilled across the parking lot like a signal fire, painting the wet asphalt in colors that looked like emergency. Nobody had touched the switch. Nobody had reset the breaker. The sign simply decided in that moment to start working again. The red lantern was open. They gathered inside. Wet leather on vinyl, steam rising from soaked jackets. Coffee brewing in the machine that Eleanor had prepped before leaving, filling the room with the smell of something warm and ordinary in the middle of something that was neither. Boots left puddles on the wood floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed their perpetual insect song. Gideon stood at the counter. Wrench, Elias, and Shepard sat at table 9. The rest of the club spread across the remaining booths, some smoking, some staring at the windows, some doing the thing combat veterans did when the situation exceeded their ability to influence it. They went still, conserved energy, and waited for orders. Camden stood near the kitchen door, dripping on the floor Eleanor would have made him mop. "The drive has everything," Camden said, his voice raw from rain and adrenaline and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from detonating your own life. Financial records from 7 fiscal years, transfer authorizations with his digital signature, routing numbers for shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, names of intermediaries, amounts, dates, all of it. "All of it means nothing if it stays in this room," Elias said from table 9. His medic's bag sat at his feet, and he had the same calm, methodical energy he carried into every crisis. The energy of a man who triaged before he treated. and never wasted a bandage on a wound that didn't need one. We go to the FBI answers to the same people who sent those agents tonight. We go to state investigators. The Senators' Committee oversees their budget. We go to local police. Local police couldn't investigate a missing bicycle in this town, Wrench muttered. So we skip all of them, Gideon said. Every head turned. The county courthouse opens at 8 a.m. There's a federal records office on the second floor, and there are reporters, real ones, who've been trying to get access to the senators' financial records for years. Marla Chen at the Billings Gazette, David Kowalski at the Helena Independent. I've had contact with both of them through the Veteran Advocacy Network. You've been planning this, Shepard said quietly from the corner. Not an accusation, an observation. The observation of a man who had known Gideon long enough to recognize the difference between spontaneous action and a contingency that had been sitting in a drawer for years. I've been preparing for the possibility, Gideon corrected. Since the senator's office tried to defund the VA clinic in Hayworth 2 years ago, I started building contacts, reaching out to journalists who weren't afraid of political retaliation, establishing relationships with editors who would verify before they printed and wouldn't fold under pressure. You never told us. Because I hoped I'd never need to. Shepard held Gideon's gaze. Between them, decades of trust stretched like a wire that was strong enough to hold but thin enough to feel dangerous. These men had survived together, grieved together, rebuilt each other from the fragments left by wars that the country had already stopped thinking about. The information that Gideon had been secretly preparing for a confrontation with a senator, that he'd been gathering weapons without the club's knowledge, didn't break the trust. But it bent it, and bent trust, like bent metal, never quite returned to its original shape. All right, Shepard said finally. The courthouse. But not just Camden, Gideon continued. Not just the drive. All of us. Full formation. Every member. We ride to the courthouse at dawn, in cuts, on bikes, and we stand behind this kid while he hands that evidence to people who can use it. Because a senator's son walking in alone with a flash drive is a troubled kid having a breakdown. A senator's son walking in backed by 10 veterans who've been protecting this community for 3 years is a story that doesn't disappear. It also makes us targets, Wrench said. We've been targets since the night we stood up in this diner. We just didn't have anything worth shooting at. The room went quiet. Coffee machine hissing. Rain on the roof. The neon sign buzzing its newly resurrected red glow through the window. 10 men calculating the cost of what was being asked of them. Not in money, not in time, but in the specific currency that veterans understood better than anyone: exposure. The willingness to be visible in a situation where visibility meant vulnerability. There's something else, Camden said. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe. His face was pale beneath the fluorescent light, pale and angular, and older than it had looked 3 weeks ago, as if the diner had aged him forward by a decade. His hands were at his sides, the cuts on his right palm still seeping thin lines of blood that mixed with rainwater and dripped onto the floor. My father mentioned Wyoming, Camden said. When Mercer brought it up, Gideon, you reacted. Something in your face moved. I saw it. The diner went very still. What happened in Wyoming? Gideon didn't answer. He stood behind the counter with his hands flat on the surface, and for the first time since Camden had met him, his composure showed a crack. Not in his expression. His face was still the same granite mask that had stared down a senator's son and 2 federal agents in a single night. But in his body, in the way his shoulders tightened, in the way his weight shifted forward onto his hands, as if the counter was the only thing keeping him vertical. Wrench looked at Elias. Elias looked at Shepard. Shepard looked at the ceiling. Tell him, Shepard said. It's not relevant. It's about to be used against us. That makes it relevant. Gideon's jaw worked sideways. The scar along his temple caught the light and threw a shadow that looked like a fissure running through stone. 6 years ago, Gideon said slowly, each word placed with the reluctance of a man removing stitches from a wound that hadn't finished healing. Our Wyoming chapter. 12 members. They were running a community protection program, escorting women and children out of domestic violence situations when the police wouldn't act, which was most of the time. He paused, breathed, The sound was audible, heavy, controlled, the breathing of a man managing pain. One of the situations went bad. A husband, ex-military, like us, armed, drunk. He'd beaten his wife unconscious and was holding his 2 kids in a barricaded house. Police had been called 3 times in 6 months, restraining orders filed. Nothing happened. The system did what the system does. It documented the violence and waited for someone to die so there'd be enough paperwork to act. Camden listened with the specific focus of a man who was beginning to understand that the people he'd judged his entire life carried histories that made his own suffering look like a paper cut. Our guys went in, Gideon continued, pulled the wife out, got the kids. But the husband came after them with a shotgun. One of our members, a man named Dalton, 43, father of 3, took a blast in the shoulder, getting those kids into a truck. Dalton survived. But the confrontation was caught on a neighbor's security camera, and the county prosecutor decided to charge 3 Iron Saints with breaking and entering, assault, and interference with a domestic situation. They were rescuing children, Camden said. The law doesn't distinguish between rescue and interference when you don't have a badge. The charges were eventually dropped. Insufficient evidence, public pressure. The wife testified on our behalf. But the investigation lasted 14 months, cost us $80,000 in legal fees, destroyed 3 members' employment. Dalton's shoulder never healed right. He can't ride anymore. He lives in Billings and manages a hardware store, and every morning he takes 15 minutes to put on a shirt because his arm doesn't work the way it used to. Gideon looked at Camden with eyes that carried the weight of every compromise, every failure, every time the Iron Saints had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it by the same institutions that were supposed to be doing it themselves. That's Wyoming, Gideon said. That's what your father will use. Not the truth of it, the appearance of it. A biker club with a history of violent confrontations, a pattern of vigilante behavior, men who take the law into their own hands because they've decided they know better than the system. But you do know better than the system, Camden said. The system let that woman get beaten for 6 months. Try explaining that to a jury. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than the leather. Heavier than the rain. The silence of men who had spent their lives doing work that the world needed but wouldn't acknowledge. Protecting people in the gaps between laws, catching the fallen who slipped through institutional cracks, standing in the dark places where badges and bureaucracy refused to go. Elias broke it. He stood up from table 9, picked up his medic's bag, and walked to Camden. Without asking, he took Camden's bleeding hand, opened the bag, and began cleaning the cuts with antiseptic that stung hard enough to make Camden's breath hitch. "Hold still," Elias said. His voice carried the same no-nonsense authority he'd used on soldiers bleeding out in field hospitals. Not cruel, not kind, just efficient. "You're going to need this hand tomorrow. Can't hold a flash drive if you can't close your fist." He cleaned each cut with methodical precision. Applied butterfly bandages. Wrapped the palm in gauze that he tore with his teeth because his hands were occupied. The entire process took 3 minutes and was performed with the silent, focused competence of a man who had patched broken people so many times the motions were encoded in his muscles. "Thank you," Camden said. Elias didn't acknowledge it. He closed his bag, returned to table 9, and sat down. That was how care worked in the Iron Saints. It was administered without fanfare and accepted without ceremony. Like breathing, like riding, like showing up. At 4:17 a.m., the rain began to slow. At 4:43, Eleanor Vale's car pulled into the parking lot. She emerged in the gray pre-dawn light wearing her winter coat over a flannel shirt, carrying a thermos of coffee she'd made at home because the diner's machine took too long to heat up. She saw the motorcycles, saw the wet leather, saw 10 men and a senator's son sitting in her diner at an hour when the only living things were supposed to be the coffee machine and the mice behind the walk-in freezer. She stopped in the doorway. "Someone better tell me what's happening," she said. Gideon told her. He told her everything. The flash drive, the senator's stolen funds, the FBI agents, Wyoming, the plan for the courthouse at dawn. He told her with the same steady, unadorned voice he used for everything. No drama, no embellishment, no attempt to soften the parts that would hurt. And the parts that hurt were the parts about Frank. Eleanor stood behind the counter, her counter, the one she'd stood behind for 11 years, the one she'd leaned on when the exhaustion was too heavy and the nights were too long and the world was too indifferent to notice, and listened to Gideon explain that her husband had died because a senator had stolen the money that would have saved him, that the system designed to catch the theft was built by the thief, that the federal agents investigating the theft were working for the thief, that every institution she'd been taught to trust, the government, the healthcare system, the justice system, the fundamental architecture of a country her husband had served for 23 years, had been compromised at the exact points where it mattered most. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She stood very still, holding her thermos, and stared at a point on the wall above Gideon's head. Her eyes were dry. Her breathing was even. Her hands, those trembling, overworked 62-year-old hands, were absolutely motionless for the first time in months. The tremor had stopped. "Eleanor," Gideon said quietly. She looked at him, through him, past him to the wall where a photograph of the diner's original owner hung in a crooked frame, a black and white image of a man in an apron standing behind the same counter in 1962, back when the world was different but the work was the same. "I knew," she said. Every man in the room stopped breathing. "I knew something was wrong with Frank's treatment. I knew the funding had been cut. I went to the VA office four times, and asked why his appointments were being delayed. They gave me forms, told me to file appeals, put me on hold for 45 minutes, and then hung up." Her voice was steady, terrifyingly steady. The voice of a woman whose anger had gone past heat into something colder, harder, more permanent. "I wrote letters. I called my congressman's office. I called the senator's office." She paused. "I called your father's office," she said, looking at Camden. Camden felt the blood leave his face. A woman answered, took my name, took Frank's service number, told me someone would call back. Eleanor set the thermos on the counter with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Nobody called back. Frank died 11 weeks later. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed. The coffee machine hissed. The neon sign outside pulsed its red signal into the gray morning, and 10 men sat in silence, watching a 62-year-old waitress carry a weight that would have crushed most people. Carry it the way she carried plates and problems and other people's messes, with her back straight and her eyes forward and her broken heart beating inside a chest that refused to collapse. "I'm going with you," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, I'm going to the courthouse when you go." She untied her apron, folded it, set it on the counter beside the thermos. The movements were ceremonial, slow, deliberate, the gestures of a woman putting down tools she'd carried for 11 years. If that boy is going to stand up and tell the truth about what his father did, then the woman who lost her husband because of it should be standing beside him. That's not courage. That's just accounting. Gideon looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. 5 a.m., he said. "We ride at 5. The next 43 minutes passed in a silence that felt like the inside of a held breath. Elias checked his medical kit. Wrench made 2 phone calls, quiet, clipped conversations in which he used words like timeline and digital backup and chain of custody, with the precision of a man who'd been thinking about legal strategy longer than he'd admitted. Shepard sat alone at the counter with a cup of black coffee he never drank, his weathered hands folded around the ceramic, his eyes focused on something invisible and distant. Camden stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Eleanor. She'd put on a clean blouse she kept in her locker for emergencies, white, pressed, the kind of blouse a woman wore to job interviews and funerals, and moments that required dignity to be visible. She'd combed her hair, applied lipstick, a small, precise act that took 10 seconds and changed her face from exhausted to resolute. She looked like a woman preparing for a war she'd already been fighting for 4 years without knowing who the enemy was. "I'm sorry," Camden said. Eleanor looked at him. "For Frank, for the phone call no one returned, for the money, for the spit." His voice cracked on the last word. Not from weakness, but from the structural failure of trying to contain too many apologies in a single sentence. "For all of it." Eleanor studied his face, the calloused hands, the bandaged palm, the stained apron he'd forgotten to remove still tied over his soaked jacket like a second skin he'd grown without noticing. "The apology I needed," she said quietly, wasn't words. It was you standing in that courthouse. She turned and walked back to the counter. At 5 a.m., Gideon stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The sky was the color of iron, heavy, gray, pressing down on the Montana landscape like a lid on a pot that was about to boil over. The parking lot was wet. The air smelled like cold asphalt and pine, and the distant, almost imaginary scent of snow that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. 10 motorcycles sat in a line, chrome gleaming with residual rain, engines cold, waiting. Gideon mounted his bike, turned the key. The Harley's engine caught with a sound that was half thunder and half heartbeat, the low guttural roar that had been the soundtrack of his life for 20 years. One by one, the other 9 engines followed. The parking lot filled with sound, deep, resonant, the kind of sound you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. Camden stood beside Eleanor's car. He had no motorcycle, no leather vest, no membership in anything except the fragile, unnamed thing that had formed between him and these men over 22 days of grease burns and mopped floors, and conversations held in the dark about the shape of the world and who was responsible for breaking it. Wrench pulled a spare helmet from his saddlebag and tossed it to Camden without looking. Camden caught it. The weight of it surprised him, heavy, scratched, real in a way that nothing in his previous life had ever been. "You ride behind me," Wrench said. "Hold on. Don't lean. Don't talk." Camden put on the helmet, climbed onto the back of Wrench's bike. His hands gripped the seat rail. The engine vibrated through his entire body, through his bandaged hand, through his aching legs, through the apron still tied across his chest, through every cell that had been rebuilt by 3 weeks of work he'd never expected to do. Eleanor followed in her car, a 17-year-old Honda Civic with 200,000 miles and a crack in the windshield that had been there since before Frank died. She drove behind the formation with her headlights on, and her hands steady on the wheel, and a look on her face that wasn't fury and wasn't grief, but something beyond both. The expression of a woman driving toward the place where 4 years of unanswered questions would finally meet the man who was responsible for the silence. They rode toward town in formation, 10 bikes and a Honda Civic moving through the gray Montana dawn, on roads that were still wet, past fields that were still dark, under a sky that looked like it was holding its breath. Gideon in front, Wrench and Camden behind him, Elias and Shepard flanking. The rest spread across the highway in a V pattern that looked, from above, like the tip of a spear aimed at the heart of Millbrook. The county courthouse appeared at the end of Main Street as the first light broke through the clouds. Gray stone, white columns, American flag hanging limp in the windless morning. The building looked exactly like what it was, an institution designed to process the orderly resolution of disputes between civilized people who believed in the system. It had not been designed for what was coming. The motorcycles pulled into the courthouse lot at 5:38 a.m., 22 minutes before the building opened. They parked in a row along the front curb, 10 bikes, chrome facing the street, engines cutting to silence in sequence like a countdown ending. Eleanor parked behind them, killed her engine, sat in the car for a moment with her hands on the wheel, staring at the courthouse steps through the cracked windshield. Then she got out. She walked to the front of the formation and stood beside Gideon. A 62-year-old waitress in a white blouse and a winter coat, standing next to a scarred veteran in worn leather in front of a county courthouse at dawn, waiting for the doors to open so they could burn down a senator's empire with a flash drive and the truth. Behind them, Camden stood on the courthouse steps with his bandaged hand in his pocket, touching the edges of the drive through the fabric. His heart was hammering. His mouth was dry. His legs were shaking from the motorcycle ride and the cold and the fear and the absolute irreversible certainty that what he was about to do would destroy the last remnants of the life he'd known. 2 TV vans appeared at the end of Main Street, then a third. Wrench's phone calls had worked. The journalists Gideon had cultivated for 2 years were arriving. Cameras and microphones, and the specific hungry energy of reporters who smelled something that couldn't be buried. Then a 4th vehicle appeared. Black, government plates, a Suburban identical to the one from the parking lot. It stopped at the opposite end of Main Street. The engine stayed running. The doors didn't open. And from inside the vehicle, Camden's phone rang. He pulled it out. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in 22 days. Dad. His thumb hovered over the screen. Rain that had started again. Light, almost invisible, more mist than rain, settled on the glass between his skin and his father's name. Gideon turned and looked at him. Eleanor turned and looked at him. 10 bikers in scarred leather, standing in formation on the steps of a courthouse in small-town Montana at dawn, turned and looked at a 24-year-old kid in a stained apron with a bandaged hand and a flash drive in his pocket, and his father's name glowing on a screen that the rain was slowly blurring. Camden answered the phone. "Don't do this." His father's voice was stripped of everything. No authority, no strategy, no performance. Just the raw, scraped hollow sound of a man watching his architecture collapse in real time. "Camden, please, don't do this." Camden looked at Eleanor. She was watching him. Her face was still. Her eyes were dry. Her trembling hands, those hands that had poured 100,000 cups of coffee and wiped his spit from her own face and carried a 9-year-old granddaughter's entire future on their broken joints, were folded in front of her. Steady. "I'm already doing it," Camden said. He hung up. The courthouse doors opened at 6 a.m. Light spilled down the steps like an invitation. The TV cameras powered on. Reporters moved into position. The Suburban at the end of the street didn't move. And Camden Royce, son of a senator, former monster, 22-day dishwasher, holder of a flash drive stained with his own blood, looked at Gideon Cross, looked at Eleanor Vale, looked at 10 men who'd taught him that strength wasn't dominance but presence, and began walking up the courthouse steps toward the doors, toward the light, toward the thing he couldn't take back and didn't want to. Behind him, the Iron Saints followed, not as bodyguards, not as enforcers, not as the outlaw gang the world would try to paint them as in the headlines that would follow, as witnesses, as the men who stood up in a diner when nobody else would. And Eleanor Vale walked beside Camden with her back straight and her white blouse bright against the gray morning and her husband's name beating inside her chest like a drum that had been waiting 4 years to be heard. The courthouse swallowed them whole. And outside, in the parking lot, the black Suburban finally opened its doors. But by then, the cameras were already rolling, and the truth had already started moving, and there was nothing left in Senator Royce's arsenal that could stop what 10 broken men and 1 exhausted woman and 1 ruined boy had set into motion on the steps of a building that was, for once, about to be used for exactly what it was built for. The flash drive connected to the Federal Records clerk's computer at 6:09 a.m. Camden's bandaged hand was shaking when he plugged it in. Not from fear, from the irreversible weight of a gesture that couldn't be undone. The clerk, a woman in her 50s named Donna, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had worked in the Millbrook County Courthouse for 22 years without once encountering anything more dramatic than a contested property line, stared at the screen as the files loaded, and her face went through a transformation that Camden would remember for the rest of his life. Confusion first, then recognition. Then the slow, dawning horror of a person who was looking at numbers that represented stolen lives. "These are federal fund transfers," Donna said. Her voice had the careful, measured quality of someone trying very hard not to react to what they were seeing. "Veterans' health care allocations, redirected to—" She stopped, scrolled, stopped again. "These accounts aren't on any registry I've ever seen." "Shell companies," Camden said. "Registered under intermediary names. The beneficial owner is Senator Camden Royce Sr." Donna looked at him over her reading glasses. Then she looked past him, through the glass partition, into the lobby, where 10 men in leather vests stood in a loose formation facing the entrance, and a 62-year-old woman in a white blouse sat on a wooden bench, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor. "I need to make some calls," Donna said. "Make them." She did. 3 calls in 12 minutes. The first to the county registrar, the second to the state attorney general's office in Helena, the third to a number she read from a card she kept in her desk drawer. A card, Camden noticed, that was worn at the edges from handling, as if she'd been waiting years for a reason to use it. By 7:15 a.m., the courthouse had changed. 2 investigators from the state AG's office arrived in an unmarked sedan, carrying briefcases and the specific expression of people who had been woken up early for something that justified the lost sleep. They met with Camden in a small conference room on the second floor, while Gideon stood outside the door with his arms crossed and his back against the wall, not guarding exactly, but present in the way a foundation is present beneath a building, unseen, essential, carrying weight. Camden talked for 90 minutes. He talked about the flash drive, about the shell companies, about the routing numbers and transfer authorizations, and the 7 years of diverted funds. He talked about his father's study and the monogram stationery and the scotch and the threat, not leaving as my son. He talked about the FBI agents in the parking lot, about Agent Mercer, about the surveillance that had been positioned not to investigate corruption but to contain it. And then he talked about Eleanor, about Frank Vale, 23 years of service, pancreatic cancer, a waiting list at a VA facility that had lost its funding because the money that should have sustained it had been siphoned through accounts that existed only on paper. A phone call to the senator's office. A woman who answered and took a name and a service number and promised someone would call back. The silence that followed. The 11 weeks. The death. One of the investigators, a woman named Torres with close-cropped hair and the focused intensity of someone who had built a career on the belief that systems could be repaired, stopped writing. Set down her pen, looked at Camden. You understand that your testimony, combined with this evidence, will likely result in federal charges against your father, she said. Grand jury indictment, criminal prosecution, prison. I understand. And that you'll be called to testify, publicly, under oath, against your own father. I know. Torres studied him. The bandaged hand, the stained apron he still hadn't removed, tied over a jacket that smelled like rain and motorcycle exhaust, and the industrial degreaser Eleanor used on the flat-top grill. He looked nothing like the son of a senator. He looked like a line cook who'd been awake for 30 hours and had recently made a decision that would cost him everything he'd ever been given. We'll need 48 hours to verify the financial records, Torres said. Cross-reference the transfer authorizations. Confirm the shell company registrations. If the evidence holds, and from what I'm seeing, it will, we'll move to secure a federal warrant. What about the FBI team? Mercer? Torres exchanged a glance with her colleague. The glance contained an entire conversation about jurisdictional complications, about internal affairs investigations, about the specific bureaucratic nightmare of discovering that federal agents had been operating under the direction of the target they were supposed to be investigating. That's being handled separately, Torres said, through channels that Senator Royce doesn't control. Camden nodded, stood up. His legs were unsteady, the kind of unsteadiness that came not from physical weakness, but from the sudden absence of tension. For 3 weeks, every muscle in his body had been carrying a weight that he hadn't fully understood until it began to lift. The removal of it left him hollow, shaky, like a building after the scaffolding comes down and you find out whether the walls can stand on their own. He walked out of the conference room and found Gideon exactly where he'd left him, back against the wall. Arms crossed, face unreadable. It's done, Camden said. Gideon looked at him. Those pale gray eyes that had seen everything, combat zones and funeral homes and the inside of a foster care report about a son who wouldn't look at him, studied Camden's face with the same careful attention he'd given Eleanor's trembling hands 3 weeks ago. No, Gideon said quietly. It's starting. He was right. The next 72 hours were a controlled demolition. The State Attorney General's office verified the financial records in 36 hours instead of 48. The evidence was, according to Torres, the most comprehensive documentation of public fund diversion we've seen in this state in 2 decades. Every transfer was time-stamped. Every shell company was traceable. Every authorization carried the digital signature of Senator Camden Royce Sr., applied with the specific carelessness of a man who had never imagined that the architecture of his corruption would be disassembled by his own son. The federal warrant was issued on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday evening, the story had broken. Marla Chen at the Billings Gazette published first, a 4,000-word investigation that laid out the financial trail with the precision of an autopsy report. She named the shell companies. She named the intermediaries. She named the senator. And she named the veterans who had died on waiting lists at facilities that had lost funding because of the diversions. 11 names, 11 service records, 11 families who had buried someone who should have survived. Frank Vale was the third name on the list. David Kowalski at the Helena Independent published 2 hours later, focusing on the FBI angle, the surveillance team that had been deployed not to investigate the corruption, but to protect it. Agent Mercer's name appeared in the 4th paragraph. By the 6th paragraph, the FBI's Internal Affairs Division had opened a formal inquiry. By Thursday morning, every major news outlet in Montana had picked up the story. By Thursday afternoon, it had gone national. Senator Camden Royce Sr. held a press conference at 4 p.m. on Thursday. He stood behind a podium in his Helena office, flanked by lawyers, and delivered a statement that contained the words mischaracterization and political opponents, and complete confidence in the legal process. The standard vocabulary of a powerful man attempting to reframe catastrophe as inconvenience. It didn't work. The indictment came on Friday. Federal charges. Wire fraud. Misappropriation of public funds. Obstruction. 11 counts, one for each veteran whose name appeared in Marla Chen's article. The arrest was captured on camera. 2 federal marshals, not FBI, escorting the senator from his Helena office to a waiting vehicle, while reporters shouted questions that he didn't answer and photographers captured the image that would define his legacy. A silver-haired man in a navy suit, hands at his sides, walking toward a car that wasn't a Mercedes and a future that didn't include the word senator. The recovered funds totaled $23.7 million over 7 fiscal years. Within 6 weeks, emergency allocations were approved to restore funding to 4 VA facilities across Montana that had been operating at reduced capacity. The Hayworth Clinic, the one Gideon had watched the senator's office try to defund 2 years ago, received enough money to hire 6 additional staff members and eliminate its waiting list for the first time in a decade. None of this was easy. None of this was clean. None of this happened without cost. Camden's family disowned him formally through a legal notice delivered to the Red Lantern Diner on a Tuesday afternoon by a courier who looked deeply uncomfortable handing an envelope to a man wearing an apron. The notice terminated all financial ties, removed his name from the family trust, and revoked his access to every property, account, and asset connected to the Royce estate. The language was precise, clinical, and devoid of any word that acknowledged a biological relationship between the sender and the recipient. Camden read it standing behind the counter. Then he folded it, put it in his apron pocket, and went back to clearing tables. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window. She said nothing. But that evening, after the diner closed, she left a paper bag on the counter beside the coffee machine. Inside was a sandwich, turkey, lettuce, mustard, wrapped in wax paper, and a note written in handwriting that trembled because her hands always trembled. "You're not alone. E." Camden ate the sandwich sitting at table 9 in the dark, empty diner with the neon sign painting red light across the walls, and for the second time in his life, he cried. The first time had been at age 7, when his mother had left and his father had told him that crying was a weakness that Royce men didn't indulge. He'd stopped then, sealed it, built 17 years of armor over the place where tears were supposed to come from. Now the armor was gone, stripped away by grease burns and mop handles, and the weight of a sandwich made by a woman whose husband had died because of his family. The tears came without sound, just water running down a face that had forgotten how to produce it, relearning the mechanism in real time. He wiped his face with the apron, washed the plate, locked the door, walked to the efficiency apartment he'd rented above a hardware store on the east side of Millbrook, $400 a month, paid from his diner wages, furnished with a mattress, a folding chair, and a lamp that buzzed like the ones in the Red Lantern. It was the first home he'd ever earned. 6 months passed. The seasons turned the way they do in Montana, violently, without apology. Winter collapsed into a spring that was more mud than warmth. Spring hardened into a summer that baked the highways and turned the fields golden. Summer cooled into an autumn that smelled like wood smoke and approaching frost. The Red Lantern Diner closed on a Saturday in October. Not because of the scandal, not because of financial failure, because Eleanor Vale had decided that 11 years was enough. She'd enrolled in nursing school at Montana Western in June, a decision she'd made sitting at her kitchen table at 3 a.m. after her last shift, staring at her hands and realizing that the tremor had stabilized once she'd stopped carrying the weight of a secret she didn't know she'd been carrying. The tremor wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But it had become manageable, and the way grief becomes manageable, not smaller, but more familiar, integrated into the daily architecture of a body that had learned to accommodate its own damage. She could hold a syringe. She could take a pulse. She could stand in a room with a sick person and provide the kind of care that she'd watched the system fail to provide for Frank. And the knowledge that she was becoming the thing the system should have been was more healing than any therapy or medication or well-intentioned conversation about closure. Lily was 10 now. She was reading at a 7th grade level. She played soccer with an intensity that suggested she'd inherited her grandmother's stubbornness and her grandfather's discipline. She still slept on a mattress, but a real one now, with a frame, in a bedroom that had a door and a window and a bookshelf Eleanor had bought at a thrift store and painted white. Camden had 2 jobs. He worked mornings at the diner until it closed, and afternoons at a nonprofit veterans outreach center in Millbrook that had been established with a portion of the recovered funds. He was studying social work through an online program at the University of Montana, completing coursework at night on a second-hand laptop that Wrench had rebuilt from salvaged parts and handed to him without comment or ceremony. He was 25 years old. He had $1,200 in a savings account, a rented apartment, calloused hands, and a criminal record that consisted of a single misdemeanor traffic violation from a lifetime ago. His father was awaiting trial in Helena. They hadn't spoken since the phone call on the courthouse steps. They would probably never speak again. Camden didn't know if that was grief or relief. He suspected it was both, occupying the same space inside him the way Montana weather could be sunny and snowing simultaneously, contradictory, confusing, and somehow completely natural. The diner's last night was a Thursday. Of course it was. The Iron Saints arrived at 7 p.m., riding in from the highway in formation the way they had every Thursday for 3 years. 10 bikes, 10 men, engines cutting to silence in the parking lot one by one, like a countdown that ended with the sudden, heavy presence of leather and chrome and men who carried their histories in their posture. The diner was full. Truck drivers who'd heard it was closing and drove out of their way to be there. The nurse who worked doubles at Millbrook General and had been eating pie at the counter since before Eleanor started. Carl, the 68-year-old veteran with the tremor and the coin purse with the bullet hole, sitting in his usual booth with 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast, counted out an exact change, one last time. Eleanor worked the floor, not because she had to. She'd hired a replacement 3 weeks ago, a young woman named Maria, who was efficient and kind, and didn't need to be trained because Eleanor had already trained her through 6 weeks of side-by-side shifts. Eleanor worked because it was her last night, and this was her floor, and these were her people, and she wanted to carry the plates one more time. Camden worked beside her, pouring coffee, clearing tables, moving through the room with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to navigate the diner's geography the way a sailor learns the deck of a ship, by feel, by rhythm, by the muscle memory of 100,000 repeated motions. At 9 p.m., Gideon sat down at table 9. He was alone. Wrench was at the counter, arguing with Elias about whether a 1987 shovelhead could outperform a modern twin cam in cold weather, a debate they'd been having for 2 years and would continue having until one of them died or the sun burned out, whichever came first. Shepard sat at the far end of the counter with a cup of coffee. He was actually drinking for once, watching the room with the ancient, patient attention of a man who understood that some moments were worth witnessing without commentary. Gideon's coffee was black. His hands were wrapped around the cup. His scar caught the neon light from the window and threw a shadow across his temple that looked like a river drawn on a map of terrain that had survived something catastrophic. Camden sat down across from him. They hadn't talked, really talked, since the courthouse. The aftermath had been consumed by investigations and interviews and the mechanical process of rebuilding a life from scratch. There hadn't been space for the kind of conversation that required silence around it, the way certain chemical reactions require darkness to complete. Now there was space. "I called my son," Gideon said. Camden set down his coffee cup. The words landed with the weight of something that had been carried for 14 years and was finally being set on a table. "Last week," Gideon continued, "I called the number I've had in my phone since he turned 18, the number I've looked at every night for 6 years without dialing. I called it." "Did he answer?" "Voicemail. Gideon's jaw tightened. The muscles worked beneath his skin, and the effort of the next sentence was visible. Not in his face, which remained composed, but in his hands, which tightened around the cup until the tendons stood out like cables. I left a message. 37 seconds. I told him I was sorry. I told him I should have been there. I told him I wasn't asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even a response. I just wanted him to know that I'd spent 14 years becoming the man I should have been when he needed me. The diner's sounds filled the silence between them. The coffee machine, the low murmur of conversations, the clink of ceramic on ceramic, the buzzing of fluorescent lights that had been threatening to die for years and kept surviving out of what seemed like pure stubbornness. Did he call back? Camden asked. No. Gideon paused. But someone else did. A woman. His fiancée. She said he'd listened to the message 4 times. She said he wasn't ready to talk, but he wasn't angry anymore. She said... Gideon stopped. Breathed. The breath was audible, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. She said he'd named his dog Gideon. Camden didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The information existed in a space beyond language. A man who hadn't spoken to his father in 14 years, naming a dog after him, which was simultaneously the smallest gesture in the world and the largest, because it meant the name was still spoken in a house that Gideon had never visited, attached to a living thing that was loved. That's why I pushed you, Gideon said. Shepard was right. I saw my son in you, not the way you were, the way you could be, the version that existed underneath all the damage your father built on top of you. He looked at Camden with eyes that were clear, unguarded, the rarest expression Gideon Cross ever wore. I couldn't save my boy, but I could put a napkin in your hand and see if you'd pick it up. I picked it up, Camden said. You did. They sat at table 9 in the Red Lantern Diner on its last night, 2 men separated by decades and damage and the specific, complicated wreckage of fathers who failed in different ways, one through corruption, one through absence, and between them, on the scarred table surface stained by 1,000,000 coffee rings, something that had been building for 22 days and 6 months and a lifetime reached its final shape. Not friendship exactly, not family exactly. Something without a name. The bond between a man who protected strangers because he couldn't protect his son, and a boy who destroyed his inheritance because a waitress showed him what real work looked like. At 11 p.m., Eleanor turned off the flat-top grill for the last time. The sound it made was small. A click, then a tick, then the slow cooling of metal that had been hot for 11 years. She stood in the kitchen, alone, with her hand on the knob, and listened to the silence that followed. It was a different silence than the ones she was used to. Not the silence of exhaustion, not the silence of loneliness, the silence of completion, the sound a story makes when it reaches the period at the end of its last sentence. She untied her apron, folded it the way she'd folded it 1,000 times. In thirds, creased sharp, the fold lines worn into the fabric from years of repetition. She set it on the prep counter beside the paring knife she'd used to cut 10,000 onions, and the salt shakers she'd filled every night, and the coffee scoop that was bent slightly at the handle because Frank had bent it 20 years ago trying to use it as a bottle opener, and she'd never straightened it because the bend was shaped like his grip, and she wasn't ready to lose that too. She walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room. The customers were gone. The truck drivers and the nurse and Carl and the regulars who'd come to say goodbye had filtered out into the night, leaving tips that were too large and handshakes that lasted too long, and the awkward, insufficient words that people use when they're trying to say thank you for something that can't be measured in language. The Iron Saints remained. They were gathered at table 9, and the booths surrounding it, spread across the room the way they'd been spread across the room every Thursday for 3 years. Leather vests, scarred hands, coffee cups held too tight, the quiet weight of men who carried damage they never discussed in a space that had never asked them to explain it. Gideon stood up. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest, the pocket closest to his chest, the one where he'd carried the flash drive, the one positioned directly over his heartbeat, and pulled out something that wasn't a flash drive. It was a leather vest, not full club colors, not a patched-in member's cut, something simpler. Black leather, weathered, with a single small patch stitched above the left breast pocket. The patch was hand-sewn, the stitching slightly uneven, the thread a dark red that matched the neon sign outside. 3 words in block letters: Protector in Training. The diner went quiet. Gideon held the vest out to Camden. No speech, no ceremony, no explanation of what it meant or what it cost or what obligations it carried. The gesture was its own language, the language of men who had learned to communicate through actions because words had failed them too many times, in too many hospitals and courtrooms and empty houses where the people they loved had stopped being. Camden took the vest. The leather was soft, broken in by someone else's body, someone else's rides, someone else's weather. It had history in it. Weight. The kind of weight that didn't come from material but from meaning. He put it on over his apron. The apron strings hung below the vest's hem. The stained white fabric showed beneath the black leather. The combination should have looked absurd, a line cook wearing a biker's vest, but instead it looked like the most honest thing in the room. A man who was both things simultaneously, a worker and a protector, a servant and a fighter. Someone who had learned that the distance between pouring coffee and standing up for a stranger was shorter than anyone imagined. Wrench nodded once. Elias raised his coffee cup an inch, not a toast, just an acknowledgement. Shepard closed his eyes and breathed in through his nose, slowly, deeply, the breath of a man who had just witnessed something he'd been waiting to witness. Eleanor stood at the counter. She was looking at Camden, at the vest, at the apron beneath it, at the hands, calloused, bandaged, rebuilt, that had once been used to humiliate her and were now being used to carry everything she'd taught him. She walked to him, stood in front of him, reached up and straightened the vest's collar, the way a mother straightens a child's jacket before school, the way a woman adjusts the clothing of someone she has decided belongs to her in the only way that matters, not by blood, not by law, but by the choice to keep showing up. Frank would have liked you, she said. Not at first, but eventually. Camden's throat closed. He nodded. It was all he could manage. At midnight, Eleanor locked the Red Lantern Diner's front door for the last time. The key turned in the lock with a sound that was small and final and carried the weight of 11 years inside its click. She put the key in her coat pocket, stood on the front step, looked at the neon sign, the red lantern that had buzzed and flickered and died and come back to life and cast its red glow across this parking lot through every storm and every season and every terrible, beautiful, ordinary night that had happened beneath it. She reached around the doorframe and flipped the switch. The red lantern went dark. For a moment, the parking lot existed in pure darkness. No neon, no fluorescent, just the distant glow of the highway and the cold white points of Montana stars appearing through breaking clouds. Then 10 motorcycle engines started. The sound built from nothing to everything, a deep rolling thunder that started as a vibration in the asphalt and grew into something you felt in your ribcage, your teeth, the hollow spaces behind your eyes. 10 Harleys, idling in formation, their headlights cutting through the dark and parallel beams that illuminated the parking lot and the building and the woman standing on the step with a key in her pocket and a future she'd built from wreckage. Gideon pulled out first. His bike rolled past Eleanor and he looked at her. One look, steady, unguarded, the look of a man who had been protecting strangers his entire adult life because it was the only way he knew to survive the guilt of not protecting his son. And then he was past her, turning onto the highway, his taillight shrinking into the dark. Wrench followed, then Elias, then Shepard. One by one, the Iron Saints rode out of the Red Lantern's parking lot for the last time, each man passing Eleanor with a nod or a look, or the slight, almost invisible raising of 2 fingers from the handlebar. The biker's salute, the gesture that meant, I see you without the burden of saying it out loud. The engines faded. The highway absorbed them. The sound diminished from thunder to rumble to hum to memory, until the only things left in the parking lot were Eleanor's Honda Civic, Camden's borrowed truck, and the silence of a building that had spent 60 years being a place where tired people came to be seen. Eleanor stood in the dark for a long time. Camden stood beside her. Neither spoke. The wind came down from the mountains carrying the first real cold of October. Not winter yet, but the promise of it, the advance guard of a season that would bury everything in white and force the world to start over. "Lily has a soccer game tomorrow," Eleanor said finally. "What time?" 10. "I'll be there." Eleanor looked at him. In the starlight, her face was silver and shadow. The face of a woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her, not through strength or courage or any of the words people use to describe resilience, but through the simple, stubborn, unremarkable act of waking up every morning and going to work. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." She nodded, walked to her car, got in, started the engine, the old Honda coughing to life with the mechanical reluctance of a vehicle that had outlived every reasonable expectation for its survival. She pulled out of the parking lot, her headlights sweeping across the dark building one final time, and drove toward town, toward a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where a 10-year-old girl was sleeping on a real mattress, in a real bed, in a room with a door. Camden stood alone in the empty parking lot. The diner was dark behind him. The neon sign was dead. The highway stretched in both directions, east toward a past he'd dismantled, west toward a future he couldn't see. Above him, the Montana sky opened into the kind of vastness that made human problems look like what they were: small, temporary, survivable. He untied his apron, folded it, set it on the step beside the locked door, the way you set flowers on a grave, not because the dead can see them, but because the living need to leave something behind. The vest stayed on. He walked to his truck, got in, started the engine. The heater kicked on with a rattle that filled the cab with warm air that smelled like dust and old upholstery, and the ordinary miracle of machinery working the way it was supposed to. He drove toward town, toward his apartment above the hardware store, toward a morning shift at the Veterans Outreach Center and an afternoon studying social work and a soccer game at 10 o'clock where he'd sit in the bleachers beside a woman who'd taught him more about strength in 6 months than his father had taught him about power in 24 years. And somewhere on the highway ahead of him, or behind him, or scattered across the frozen Montana dark in every direction, the Iron Saints were riding. 10 men on 10 motorcycles, engines rumbling through the cold night air, carrying their damage and their purpose, and their scarred leather, and their silence toward whatever broken person needed them next. They weren't heroes. They'd be the first to tell you that. Heroes existed in stories that ended with applause and gratitude and the satisfying resolution of a world made right. These men existed in the space after the story, in the ongoing, unfinished, never completed work of showing up for people the system had stopped seeing. The highway was dark. The cold was real. The engines were loud enough to feel in your bones and quiet enough to disappear into distance. And Camden Royce, disowned son, former monster, dishwasher, protector in training, drove through the Montana night with a borrowed vest over a folded apron and calloused hands on a steering wheel, and the first thing he'd ever built that couldn't be taken away from him. Not money, not power, not a name, just the knowledge that he'd stood up when it mattered, that he'd picked up the napkin, that somewhere in a small apartment, a woman he'd once humiliated was sleeping without the weight of an unanswered question pressing on her chest for the first time in 4 years. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.